Okay, so I got to tell you about this thing that happened years ago, but it still messes with me sometimes. I was just a kid back then, 16, and thought I was all grown up and tough. Boy, was I wrong. It was late October, cold as hell already. We lived out in the sticks in southern Ohio, and you know how those autumn nights can get. The kind that chills you right to the bone, even if you're bundled up. This was back when I was still tagging along with my older neighbor Richard and his buddies. Richard, he was a seasoned hunter, the kind of guy who could track a deer through thick brush blindfolded. I looked up to him. They were going raccoon hunting that night, and Richard asked if I wanted to come along. Of course, I jumped at the chance. Sounded like a blast to a kid who thought he knew it all. We left after dark from our place, Moreno County, drove out east towards Shawnee State Forest. Now Shawnee Forest, even during the day, it's different. Big old trees, places where the sun don't even bother trying to reach. At night? Forget about it. It's pitch black, the kind of black where your flashlight beam feels swallowed whole after just a few feet. When we got deep into the woods, I mean really deep, past where anyone normal would go, Richard let the dogs out. He had these hounds, bluegasses I think he called them. Loud, boisterous dogs when they were riled up, but they knew their stuff. They vanished into the dark, their barks fading as they took off to find a scent. We followed on foot, just the four of us, Richard, me, and these two other older guys. I think their names were Dale and maybe Gary, something like that. They were always with Richard on these hunts. We walked for what felt like forever, crunching through fallen leaves. Then it started to snow. Not heavy, but those tiny, sharp flakes that sting your face and make everything kind of blurry. The ground started to get that thin white dusting, and the air got even colder. We were near this creek. It was mostly frozen over already, just trickles of water running in the middle. I was watching my step, you know, trying not to eat it on the slippery ground, when I saw them. Footprints in the fresh snow. But these weren't animal tracks. They were human, except way bigger, monstrous big. I stopped dead in my tracks. They were bare footprints too, which is just crazy in that kind of weather. 16 inches long, easy, and wide, man, like 6 or 7 inches across. No boot, no sock print, nothing but bare foot. And the shape, definitely foot-shaped, 5 toes and everything, just huge. I felt this weird prickle on the back of my neck, a really uneasy feeling. It was just wrong. I started following the tracks. They went up this bank, kinda steep, and disappeared into the really thick woods. My heart started beating faster. I thought maybe it was Richard playing some kind of stupid prank on me. But it didn't feel like a prank. It felt heavy. I called out to Richard and the others, "Hey guys, check this out." They walked over, their flashlights bouncing around. "You seeing things, kid?" Richard chuckled. But then he shined his light down at the tracks, and he stopped chuckling. He got quiet real fast. Dale and Gary, they came up too and looked. You could see their faces in the flashlight beams, going from joking to confused, then, I don't know, almost scared. "What the hell?" Dale muttered, bending down for a closer look. Gary didn't say anything, he just kept staring. Richard crouched down and ran his hand along the edge of one of the footprints. His face went all tight and serious, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He stood up and looked around, scanning the woods with his flashlight, like he was expecting to see something. "All right," Richard said, his voice lower now, not joking around at all. Let's move on." He didn't say anything more about the footprints. Didn't say it was a joke, didn't say what he thought they were. Just told us to move on, but he sped up. He started walking faster, and we all kinda hurried to keep up. We could still hear the dogs baying in the distance, and Richard started heading in that direction, but faster than he usually would. We pushed through the trees. The snow was picking up a little now, everything getting whiter and quieter, except for the crunching of our boots and our own breathing. And then we saw it. A light. In the distance, through the trees, pulsing. At first I thought it was another flashlight, maybe lost hunters or something, but it wasn't right. It was blue, a bright electric blue, and it was flickering, like a flame. Not a steady light, but alive, moving, like something burning. We stopped again, staring at it. It was out there, maybe 100 yards away, maybe more, hard to tell in the woods at night. And it was blue, just this eerie blue light glowing in the darkness. It wasn't gas like a lantern, it looked like a ball of blue fire, but floating. "What in God's name is that?" Gary whispered, his voice shaky this time. Dale just pointed, speechless. Richard was still frowning, his eyes fixed on the blue flame. He looked really uncomfortable now, more than uncomfortable, almost worried. "Stay together," he mumbled, and started walking towards it, but slower now, cautious. We followed, keeping close behind him. As we moved, the blue flame moved too. Not towards us, but like it was keeping pace with us, staying the same distance away. It was watching us, I swear, like it knew we were there and was keeping an eye on us. For maybe an hour we kept going like that, walking, stopping, watching the blue flame. It danced between the trees, always flickering, always blue, always just out of reach. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. It felt unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. And the woods around us felt different now too, quieter. Everything felt still and watching. Then just as suddenly as it appeared, the blue flame was gone. It just winked out. 1 second it was there, the next, just darkness. We stopped again, holding our breath, listening. The dogs were still barking way off, but closer now. For a second I felt relief. Maybe that weird blue light was just some kind of natural thing, swamp gas or something. Maybe it was gone now and we could get back to hunting raccoons and forget about it. That's when we heard it. A sound, a moan, long, low and gut-wrenching. It echoed through the trees, this deep, mournful wail that just cut through the silence and hit you right in the chest. Like something in terrible pain, but not human, not animal either, something else entirely. My blood turned to ice. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the most horrible sound I'd ever heard, and I knew right away in my bones that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just scary, it was wrong, like a rip in the fabric of the world, a sound that shouldn't exist. The moan faded into a series of laments, like sobbing, but deep, guttural sobbing that went on and on. It was close now, closer than the blue flame had been. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up, my skin prickled all over. What the hell is that?" Dale gasped, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. Gary just choked, making this weird whimpering sound in the back of his throat. He looked like he was about to throw up. Richard didn't say anything. He just went white as a sheet. But he moved. Fast. "Run!" he hissed, his voice strained. "Just run!" And we did. We turned and ran. I didn't even think. I just bolted, blindly crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, tripping over roots, snow flying everywhere. Richard was right behind me, Dale and Gary somewhere behind him. We ran as fast as we could, but the sound, it followed us. The wailing, sobbing sound, it chased us through the trees. It was always behind us, always just close enough to keep the terror burning in our guts. We were running so hard, I couldn't even think straight. Just run. Run from the sound. Run from whatever was making that awful noise. I lost all sense of direction. Trees spun around me in the dark. Shadows jumped and danced in my peripheral vision. I had no idea where we were, just that we had to get away from that sound. But it was like it was everywhere. It filled the woods, trapped us in this nightmare of noise. Then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, just when my lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead, the sound changed. Just as abruptly as it had started moaning, it stopped. For a split second, there was silence again. A heavy, oppressive silence that was almost as terrifying as the wailing. Then it changed. It turned into crying, baby crying. but not a normal baby crying. This was high-pitched, piercing, desperate, a baby wailing in absolute agony. It was worse than the moaning somehow. It was more human, and that made it even more disturbing. This baby cry, this ghostly, heart-wrenching sound, it started chasing us now. It was right behind us, closer than the wailing had been. It was right on our heels, filling the darkness with this unbearable sound of a child in torment. For 10 minutes, maybe longer, it felt like an eternity. We ran and ran, that baby crying sound screaming in our ears, pushing us on, driving us deeper into panic. I stumbled, fell, scrambled back up and kept running. I could hear Dale and Gary gasping and wheezing behind me. Richard was still ahead, somehow managing to keep his pace. We were running blindly, desperately hoping we were heading back towards the truck, hoping, praying we could just get out of those woods. And then, finally, blessedly, the baby crying stopped, just like that. Silence again. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It felt heavy, loaded, like something was still there, watching us, but silently now, like something had decided to stop making noise, but was still keeping track of us. We kept running, stumbling, panting. The only sounds now were our own ragged breaths, the crunch of our boots on the snow, and the snapping of branches as we plowed through the undergrowth. But I could feel it. Something was still with us. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. Big, invisible, following us, escorting us out of the woods. Then, through the trees, I saw a flicker of light. Distant, but real. Headlights. The truck. We were almost out. We broke through the tree line, and there it was, parked on the edge of the woods. The blessed sight of Richard's old pickup truck. We stumbled towards it, practically falling into the doors. Richard fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he could barely get them in the ignition. We piled into the cab, slamming the doors, locking them, like it would actually do any good against whatever was out there. Richard started the engine, gunned it, and we lurched forward, tires spitting snow and gravel. We didn't say a word, just sat there, crammed together, chests heaving, staring out the back window at the dark woods we were leaving behind. When we got to the truck, I remembered the dogs. Richard's hounds. They were in their crates in the back of the pickup. I twisted around to look. They were there, all huddled together, quiet as mice. Those dogs, usually so loud and rowdy, were completely silent. They were staring straight ahead, their bodies tense, their tails tucked tight between their legs. They were terrified, just like us. We drove back in silence. Nobody said a word about the footprints, about the blue flame, about the sounds. We just drove, fast, not stopping until we were miles away from Shawnee State Forest, back in town, back where there were streetlights and houses and normal sounds. I haven't been back to those woods at night since, and I sure as hell haven't gone raccoon hunting with Richard again. He never talked about it either, never mentioned the footprints, the flame, the cries. It was like we all just agreed to pretend it never happened. But it did. I know it did. I was there. I heard it. I felt it. And to this day, I have no idea what the hell we ran into in those woods that night. No idea at all. Story 2. October 2002. Arkansas. Way out in the sticks, Franklin County, Deep Valley National Park. Place is gorgeous in the fall. I mean breathtaking. Used to go hunting out there all the time. Squirrel mostly. Just peaceful. Me, my old Nissan pickup, my .22 rifle, and the woods. That was before. This day was just like any other hunting day. Started off perfect. Crisp air, leaves turning all kinds of colors. Reds, yellows, oranges. Drove my truck about 3/4 of a mile into this valley. Deep Valley lives up to its name, let me tell you. Pretty isolated spot, even for out there. Wasn't expecting to see another soul. Parked the truck right there on this old logging road. Didn't even bother turning it around or locking the doors. Never did out there. Felt safe, you know, like nothing bad could ever happen there. Boy, was I wrong. Got my rifle, checked the clip, loaded and ready. Started walking up this old road, maybe 100 yards from the truck. Sun was still pretty high, maybe early afternoon, maybe a little later. Can't remember exactly. Time gets funny looking back on it. Anyway, walking along, minding my own business, just enjoying the quiet, scanning the trees for movement. That's when I saw it. On my left, off the side of the road, there's this cedar tree. Good-sized one, healthy-looking, except it was broken. Snapped clean off, maybe 8 feet up from the ground. Twisted like someone had grabbed it and just wrenched it until it gave way. And the top part of it, the broken part, was hanging down, sort of leaning over the road, pointing northeast. Now that struck me as odd right away. We hadn't had any bad storms lately, no heavy winds, nothing like that. I know trees break, especially cedars sometimes. They can be brittle. But this looked different, looked forced. Walked over to it, had a good look. The break was jagged, yeah, but it was like it had been bent first, almost like metal fatigue, before it finally cracked. Weird, real weird. Scratched my head trying to figure out what could have done that. Big branch falling? Nope, no big branches down, nothing around to explain it. Lightning? Maybe, but there were no signs of burning or charring. And why just snap like that, 8 feet up? Lightning usually fries the whole tree. Stood there for a few minutes, just staring at it, turning it over in my mind. Couldn't make heads or tails of it. Finally shrugged it off. Figured, nature's weird sometimes, right? Moved on, kept walking up the road. Still thinking about that tree, though. Something about it just felt off, unnatural. Maybe 25 yards further up the road it happened again. Another cedar tree, this time on the right side of the road, broken the exact same way. Snapped about 8 feet up, top part hanging down over the road, pointing in the same direction as the first one. Northeast. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck started to prickle. That wasn't normal, not coincidence. 2 trees, broken the same way, so close together, no good reason. My mind started racing. What could do that? What has that kind of strength? And why? Bears. Could a bear break a tree like that? Maybe a young sapling, sure, but not a mature cedar like these. And the twist, the way they were broken, didn't seem like bear damage. Bears are strong, but they're not precise like that. A wave of unease washed over me. It was more than unease, actually. It was dread. That's the only word for it. Something felt really wrong. But I'm a stubborn guy. Didn't want to let it ruin my hunt. Stupid, I know now, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. Tried to focus on squirrels again. Figured maybe it was just some weird weather thing, something I didn't understand. Tried to convince myself it was nothing. Kept walking. Forest got quieter. Usually, even in the middle of the day, there's always something making noise out there. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, crickets something. But it started to get silent, unnaturally silent, like everything just shut up at once. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Made me even more uneasy, but I kept going. Foolish. Maybe half an hour before sunset, the light was starting to get that golden, slanting look. The silence went from quiet to dead. Absolutely dead. Not a sound. And then it broke. Boom, blam, boom. Loud, hollow sounds echoing through the still woods. Like someone was hitting something big and hollow over and over, like hitting a hollow tree trunk with something hard. Rock maybe, or a big piece of wood. Boom. Blam! Boom! The sound was coming from behind me, back down the road, not too far from where I'd parked my truck. My heart slammed into my ribs. Suddenly the squirrels were the furthest thing from my mind. Someone was messing with my truck. That was the first thing that jumped into my head. Kids, maybe, even though it was way out there, nowhere near any houses. Or something worse. Vandals, thieves, something bad. Adrenaline surged. I turned around, rifle raised without even thinking about it, and started walking back down the road. Fast. Not running, not yet. but fast walking, eyes scanning the woods on either side. Each step felt like it took an hour. Boom, blam, boom. The hollow sound kept coming, steady, rhythmic, like someone was just hammering away. Getting closer to where I'd left the truck, maybe 150 yards away now. And then I heard it. A growl, low, deep, guttural. Not like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a bear growl, not a dog. Something deeper, more primal. It came from the woods to my left, from the same direction as those broken trees. Stopped dead in my tracks. Everything went cold. The growling sound, it wasn't angry exactly, more guttural, like clearing its throat almost, but terrifying. My eyes snapped to the left, straining to see through the trees and bushes. Thick brush, mostly cedars and pines, undergrowth, all of it kind of tangled together. Hard to see in there, especially with the fading light. Then I saw movement. A shadow, big, darker than the shadows of the trees. Through a thin screen of branches and leaves, maybe 35-40 yards away, I saw it. A figure, large and dark, squatting. For a split second, my brain tried to make sense of it. Tried to find something familiar to latch onto. Brown fur, big. My first thought, stupidly, was bear. A cinnamon phase bear. We get them sometimes in these woods. But something was wrong. Even in the dim light, even through the brush, something about the shape was just wrong. I focused, stared harder, heart pounding in my chest. And I realized it wasn't a bear. It was nothing like a bear. The creature was crouched down on its haunches, knees slightly bent out to the sides, long arms reaching forward between its legs, fists clenched and resting on the ground, like it was bracing itself. But it wasn't looking down. It was staring straight at me. I could see its eyes, even in the shadows, 2 points of dark, deep blackness. And it was swaying, gently rocking back and forth, side to side. And I feel that cold, primal fear grip me again, just as strong as it was that night on Black Bear Road. And I wonder, what was it? What did I really see? And why did it just let me go? Sometimes in the quiet, I almost think it wasn't trying to scare me. It was just curious, like we were both looking at something strange and unfamiliar. Like we were both wondering what the other was. And that, maybe, is the scariest thought of all. Because if it was just curious, what else is out there in those woods, watching, wondering, waiting? And what happens when curiosity turns into something else? I don't know. And I really, really don't want to find out. And making that noise, that low, rumbling growl and this other sound like clicks, mouth noises, snapping its jaws together softly, like it was tasting the air. It was big, huge. Even crouched down, it looked massive. Broad shoulders, thick chest, covered in something. Dark, shaggy hair, maybe. Hard to tell in the fading light. But it wasn't fur like a bear. It was coarser, thicker, matted-looking. And the shape, it was humanoid. But wrong. Twisted. My mind went blank. Just blank terror. I was frozen, stuck to the spot, staring at this thing, this monster. My gun was in my hands, but I wasn't even thinking about it. Just staring, for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2, maybe 3 seconds. Then something snapped in my brain. Instinct, pure, raw fear, the absolute gut-wrenching terror that tells you you're about to die. I knew, in that instant, that thing was going to attack me. It was getting ready. I could feel it. Reflex took over. My rifle, I snapped it up. Didn't aim, not really. Just pointed it in the general direction of its chest, just below where I guessed its chin would be if it stood up. And I pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the silent woods. The crack of the .22 echoed around me. And it hit. I saw it hit, right where I was aiming. The reaction was instant. The creature exploded upwards. In one fluid motion, it went from crouched to standing. And when it stood, it was huge. taller than any man I'd ever seen. 8 feet, 9 feet, maybe more. Towering, arms dangling loosely at its sides now. Straightening up, it turned. Not towards me, away from me, turned its whole body and ran, bolted, straight uphill, towards the ridge above the road. I didn't even think, just kept firing, pumped round after round into its back as it ran, aiming for the center of its back, between the shoulder blades, just trying to hit it, stop it, anything. Pulling the trigger as fast as I could, the little .22 spitting out lead as fast as it could cycle, fired the whole clip, every single round. Bang, 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 all 15 of them. Empty. The rifle clicked dry in my hands. By then, the creature was already quite a ways up the slope, still running. But then, suddenly it stopped, just stopped, mid-stride, like it had run into a brick wall, and just stood there, facing uphill, back to me, motionless. Silence again. Except now, my ears were ringing from the gunshots. Standing there, me with an empty rifle in the middle of the woods, staring at this thing, this monster, standing still on the ridge above my truck. And I knew I'd hit it. Multiple times, felt the recoil, saw the impact. 7, 8, maybe even more shots I'd put into its back, at close range. Should have gone down, should have been bleeding, should have been something. But it just stood there, still, silent, like a statue carved out of shadow. Panic hit me, full-blown, icy terror. I was alone, weaponless, and there was a wounded thing up there, somewhere on that ridge, maybe watching me, maybe waiting. My truck. I had to get to my truck, had to get out of there. Didn't even think about being quiet anymore, just turned and ran. Bolted back towards my pickup as fast as my legs would carry me, tripping over roots, branches slapping me in the face, lungs burning, heart hammering. Didn't care, just run. Got to the truck, threw the empty rifle in the bed. Didn't even bother to look back. Just yanked the door open, scrambled into the cab, fumbled for the keys. Hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Key in, turn it. Engine coughed, sputtered, then caught, roaring to life. Thank God. Foot on the gas, slamming it to the floor, trying to put it in drive. Clumsy, shaking, couldn't find the gear. Finally slammed it into drive, tires spinning in the loose dirt. And then I heard it again. Movement in the woods, loud, fast, something big crashing through the brush again. Closer this time, much closer, coming from the same direction as before, from the left, coming towards me. The sound of it, huge, crashing, snapping branches, heavy footfalls, not like any animal I knew, too big, too heavy and too fast. Desperate to get the truck turned around. Narrow road, barely room to maneuver. Stomped on the brakes, spun the wheel, trying to back up, turn around. Too fast. Screeching tires, back end swung out, bang! Hit a tree, hard. Truck lurched, stalled. Cursing, frantically restarted it. Engine coughed again, then caught. Still in reverse. Floored it again. Tried to straighten out, but still too fast. Front end swung out now, bang! Hit another tree, harder this time. Grinding sound of metal on bark. Stuck. For a second I thought I was trapped, panic clawing at my throat. But no, another yank on the wheel, forward this time, foot on the gas, tires screaming again. And finally, the truck straightened out, pointing back down the road, towards safety, away from it, foot down, all the way down, pickup roaring, bouncing and swaying on the rough road, tires spitting gravel. Didn't look back, didn't dare, just drove like hell, bouncing, swerving, almost losing control a dozen times. Just kept my foot down and my eyes on the road ahead. Didn't slow down until I was out of the valley, back on the main road. Still shaking, still heart hammering like a drum solo. Pulled over on the side of the road, engine idling rough. Put my head down on the steering wheel, just tried to breathe, tried to slow down my heart, tried to make sense of anything. But there was no sense to make. Nothing that could explain what I'd seen, what I'd shot at, what I'd run from. Sat there for a long time, just trying to calm down, then finally slowly pulled myself together. Drove home. Didn't say a word to anyone. Just locked myself in my house, drank half a bottle of whiskey, and tried to forget. Never went back to Deep Valley after that. Never hunted there again. Sold that old Nissan pickup. Couldn't stand to look at it anymore. Still have nightmares sometimes. Hear that growl in my sleep. See those black eyes staring at me. Feel that cold dread wash over me all over again. Don't know what it was. Don't want to know. Some things are better left unknown. All I know is something out there in those woods. Something big, something wrong. And it broke those trees. And it looked at me. And I shot it. And it didn't even flinch. And I ran. Ran like my life depended on it. Because it did. And I'm never ever going back. Never again. Story 3. Now this was last winter, and man was it cold. For Alabama it was freezing. We had that really biting wind that just goes right through you, no matter how many layers you put on. I remember it was a Tuesday night because my husband Mark was watching his stupid Tuesday night football. He was all comfy on the couch, yelling at the TV like they could hear him, and I was stuck dealing with the trash. It was dark already, maybe around 10 or so. The kids were asleep. The house was finally quiet except for the game on the TV, and I was just trying to get the kitchen cleaned up before I could finally relax. The trash was full, overflowing, and I knew if I left it until morning, it'd be a mess. So I grabbed the trash bag, pulled on my old beat-up coat, and stepped out the back door. Our backyard is pretty big, and we've got this old walnut tree right in the corner near the fence line. It's huge, ancient-looking, and in the summer it's great for shade, but in the winter it just looks kind of spooky with its bare branches all twisted against the sky. We keep our trash cans near the back fence, behind the tree, mostly to keep them out of sight and out of the way. It's not a far walk, maybe 20 feet from the back door to the cans. The moment I stepped outside, that cold just slapped me in the face. It was that sharp, dry cold that makes your nose and ears sting. The sky was clear, and there was a moon, not full, but bright enough to cast long shadows across the yard. Everything was still, eerily still. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence except for the muffled sound of the TV from inside the house. I walked across the grass, crunching a little bit because the ground was frozen. I could see the trash cans in the shadows of the walnut tree, darker shapes against the darkness. I was thinking about how quickly I could get this done and get back inside to the warm house and maybe a cup of tea when I saw it. It was like my eyes weren't even registering what I was seeing at first. I was walking towards the trash cans, and then I just stopped, dead still. Right there in the shadows, near the base of the walnut tree, something was standing. Something big. My brain just couldn't process it. I thought maybe it was a trick of the shadows, maybe the tree trunk playing games with my eyes. But no, this was different. It was a shape. A definite shape, and it was way too big to be just shadows. It was tall, incredibly tall, like taller than anything I had ever seen in real life. It was at least twice as tall as me, maybe even more. I'm 5'5", so I'm guessing this thing was easily 6, 7 feet tall, maybe taller. And it wasn't just tall, it was bulky, solid. The moonlight wasn't directly on it because of the tree, but it was enough to see its silhouette against the paler night sky. And what I saw, it just made my blood run cold. It was like a man, but not really. It was upright, standing on 2 legs, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms looked too long, and its shoulders were massive, hunched forward a bit. And then I saw it move. It wasn't a fast movement, more like a slow shift of its weight. It stepped out of the deeper shadow of the tree trunk, just a little, and that's when I saw more details, or well, details as much as you can see in shadows and moonlight. It was covered in something dark and shaggy, like really thick, matted fur or hair. I couldn't see skin or any clothing or anything like that, just this dark, bulky, hairy shape. And it wasn't smooth fur like a dog or a bear. It looked coarse and almost bristly, I guess. My heart started hammering in my chest. I mean, really pounding. It felt like it was going to jump right out of my ribcage. My breath caught in my throat, and suddenly I felt this wave of icy fear wash over me, starting in my stomach and spreading through my whole body. I wanted to scream. I desperately wanted to scream, to yell for Mark, for anyone. But my throat was locked up. No sound would come out. It was like my vocal cords had just frozen solid along with the rest of me. I was completely paralyzed, standing there with the trash bag clutched in my hand, staring at this thing. It took another step, slow, deliberate, almost like it was feeling its way. It wasn't coming towards me, thankfully. It was moving, away. Away from the tree, away from the house, towards the back fence and the woods beyond our property. As it moved, I got a better look at its shape in the moonlight. The silhouette was still mostly dark, but I could see more of its outline. The head, it was hard to describe. It wasn't a clear human head shape. It was more rounded, almost like it didn't have a neck. Just this big, bulky body with a roundish top. And those arms, they seemed to hang down really low, almost to its knees. It moved slowly, deliberately, step by step, into the darker shadows beyond the tree. It didn't make a sound. No rustling, no snapping twigs, no heavy footsteps. Just silence, and this slow, unsettling movement of this massive shape in the darkness. I just stood there, frozen solid, watching it go. It moved towards the fence line, and then it was just gone. It just seemed to melt into the deeper shadows of the woods. One moment it was there, this towering, terrifying figure, and the next moment, nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, and the cold moonlight. For what felt like forever, I just stood there, staring at the spot where it had been. My body was shaking uncontrollably. My teeth were chattering, partly from the cold, partly from pure terror. I could feel my heart still racing a mile a minute, and my breathing was shallow, ragged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to move. My legs felt like lead, stiff and unresponsive. I stumbled backward, still clutching the trash bag like it was a lifeline. I didn't even think about the trash anymore. All I wanted to do was get back inside, back to the light, back to safety. I practically ran back to the house, fumbling with the back door handle until I finally got it open and stumbled inside. The warm air of the house hit me like a wave. It felt almost too warm, like I'd been out in the Arctic. Mark was still on the couch, yelling at the TV. He didn't even notice anything was wrong at first. "You gonna stand there in the doorway letting all the cold air in?" he said, without even turning around. I just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, trying to catch my breath and get my voice back. "Mark," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "Mark, I just saw something outside." He finally turned around then, and he saw my face. I guess I looked as scared as I felt. "What's wrong? What happened?" he asked, finally sounding concerned. He turned down the TV and got up, coming over to me. I don't know what it was," I said, my voice still shaky. "It was out by the tree, near the trash cans." "What was? Did you see an animal, a raccoon or something?" he asked, looking out the back door. He couldn't see anything from inside, just the shadows of the yard and the dark shape of the walnut tree. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It wasn't an animal. It was big, really big, and hairy, like a person, but not. I don't know how to explain it." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Ilara, you're not making any sense. Are you okay? Did you hit your head or something?" "I'm serious, Mark," I said, my voice getting a little louder. "I saw something out there. It was huge and dark, and it scared me, really scared me. I've never been this scared in my life." He could see I was serious then. He put his arm around me and led me over to the kitchen table. Okay, calm down. Tell me what you saw. Take a deep breath and tell me everything." So I did. I told him about going outside, about the cold, the silence, the shadows of the walnut tree, and then I told him about seeing it, the tall, dark shape, the way it moved, the shaggy fur. I described it as best as I could, trying to find the words to explain something that felt so unreal. He listened, but I could tell he was skeptical. He's a practical guy, Mark. He believes in what he can see and touch. He doesn't really do the whole spooky stuff. Maybe it was just a bear, he suggested, trying to sound reasonable. We're not that far from the woods. Maybe a bear wandered into the yard looking for food. No, I said firmly. It wasn't a bear. It was upright, like it was standing on two legs, and it was too tall, way too tall to be a bear. And the way it moved, it wasn't like an animal. It was more deliberate, like it was watching. He didn't argue, but I could see he still didn't believe me. Well, he said finally, maybe you just saw shadows playing tricks on you in the dark. It was cold and late. Maybe you were just tired and your eyes were playing games. I wanted to believe him. I really did. It would be so much easier if it was just my imagination, just shadows and tiredness. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I knew it wasn't just shadows. It was real, something real and terrifying. I know what I saw, Mark, I said quietly. I know I did, and I don't want to go outside again tonight. He sighed, but he could see I wasn't going to let it go. Okay, he said. Okay, we'll just stay inside for the rest of the night, and tomorrow we'll take a look around in the daylight. Maybe we'll find something, tracks or, I don't know, something to explain what you saw. He went outside and took the trash to the cans for me, even though I told him not to. He came back in quickly, locking the door behind him and checking all the windows, like suddenly worried something really was out there. We went to bed that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that shape in my mind, the tall, dark, hairy figure in the shadows. The next morning, Mark went outside first thing, like he promised. He walked around the yard, looked around the walnut tree, checked near the fence line, even went into the edge of the woods a little ways. He was out there for a good half hour, looking for something. When he came back inside, he shook his head. Nothing, he said. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. It's like nothing was ever there. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Ilara, are you sure you saw what you thought you saw? Maybe it really was just shadows. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. Because I knew. I knew what I had seen. And I knew that shadows didn't stand 6 or 7 feet tall and walk away into the woods. We never talked about it much after that. Mark tried to brush it off, told me I was probably just stressed or something. And I just let it go. What else could I do? No one would believe me anyway, and honestly, I didn't want to keep reliving it, talking about it. It was too real, too scary. But sometimes, when I'm outside at night, especially in the winter when the trees are bare and the shadows are long, I look over at the walnut tree, and I remember. I remember the cold, the silence, the fear, and I can still see it in my mind, standing there in the shadows, that tall, dark, hairy shape. I still don't know what it was. I've tried to find explanations, looked stuff up online, read about weird creatures and sightings, but nothing really fits, and I'm not even sure I want to know. Maybe some things are better left unexplained. All I know is I saw something that night, something that shouldn't exist, something that was terrifyingly real. And it changed something in me. I don't look at the dark the same way anymore. And sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still feel that cold fear grip me, just like it did that night in the backyard, under the shadows of the walnut tree. And I just have to wonder, what if it's still out there? Story 4. I had the windows up. AC was on low, just a hum in the background. Country radio playing softly. Some gospel station. I remember thinking about my sermon for Sunday, trying to piece it together in my head. Something about faith, about facing the darkness with God's light. Funny, isn't it? Given what happened. The road was empty, as it always is that late. Just me, the truck, and the woods pressing in on both sides. You know how it is on Taylor Road. Twisty, turny, can't see far ahead, just your headlights cutting through the darkness. And then it happened, just like that. 1 second I'm driving, thinking about scripture, and the next, there it was, in the road. Up ahead, maybe 50 yards in my headlights. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get deer out there all the time, leaping across the road, causing all kinds of trouble. But this wasn't a deer. It was too big, too wrong-looking. I slowed down, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was standing in the middle of the lane, blocking the whole road, and it wasn't moving, just standing there, still as a statue. My headlights hit it full on, and that's when I really saw it. And I knew right then and there, deep down in my gut, that this wasn't anything natural. It was big, taller than I am, and I'm 6 foot, maybe not quite 6 foot anymore these days, but I'm not a small man. This thing was bigger, and it was dark, not just dark clothes, dark, like shadow, like the absence of light itself. It was covered in hair, thick, matted-looking hair, all over. Dark hair. I couldn't make out any skin, just hair, everywhere, and it was hunched kind of, but still tall, broad shoulders, thick neck, like it was built wrong. It was facing away from me at first, its back to my truck, and I was just staring, frozen, hand gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I was trying to figure out what in God's name I was looking at. Bear, but bears don't stand like that, and they don't look like that. Then it turned its head, slowly, like it was in no hurry, like it knew I wasn't going anywhere. And that's when I saw its face, if you could even call it a face. It was vaguely human, in shape, round, with features in the right places, sort of, but twisted, wrong, like someone had tried to sculpt a man's face in clay, but they were drunk, or blindfolded, or just evil. The nose was flat, almost like a pig's snout, but broader. The mouth was wide, too wide, stretched thin, no lips, just a gash. And the teeth, I saw teeth, big, yellowed, pointed teeth, like a dog's, but bigger, sharper. And the eyes, God, those eyes, they were the worst part. They weren't human, they weren't animal, they were red, not just reddish-brown or bloodshot, red, glowing red, like burning coals in the darkness. They seemed to glow from inside, like they had their own light source behind them, and they were looking right at me, right through me, it felt like. No expression, just cold, empty, evil. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started hammering in my chest like a drum gone mad. Terror, real terror. Not the kind you feel when you watch a scary movie, but the kind that grips you by the throat, freezes your blood, makes you want to scream, but you can't. I was paralyzed, just staring at this thing. It didn't move for a long time, just stood there, in the middle of the road, its red eyes fixed on mine, and I swear I could feel something coming from it, something bad, something cold and dark and hungry. It wasn't just scary to look at, it felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist, like it was an abomination. Then it started to move, slowly, deliberately. It took a step towards my truck, then another. It wasn't rushing, wasn't running, it was just advancing. And every step it took, that feeling, that dark, cold hunger, it got stronger. I could feel it pressing against me like a physical weight. That's when I snapped. Something inside me just broke. The fear took over completely. Reason, logic, everything went out the window. All I knew was I had to get away from that thing. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, hard. The truck roared, jumped forward. I jerked the wheel to the right, trying to go around it, to get past it. I could hear the tires screeching on the asphalt, but it was fast, faster than I thought. As I swerved, it moved too, quick as lightning. It turned, facing me again, and started coming towards the truck. It wasn't running like an animal. It was running upright, like a man, but faster, much faster. I shot past it, just barely missing it. I could see it in my side mirror, moving, chasing after me. My heart was going to explode. I floored it, pushing the truck as hard as it would go. 80, 90, 95 miles an hour down Taylor Road in the middle of the night. Trees blurring past on either side, headlights bouncing all over the place. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, my eyes darting back and forth, terrified it would still be there behind me. And it was. For a while it was. I could see it in the mirror, a dark shape, running along the edge of the woods, keeping pace with my truck. It was unbelievable. How could anything keep up with a truck going that fast? But it was. It was running effortlessly, not even seeming to strain. Just running, keeping pace, those red eyes still burning in the darkness. I was screaming now, just yelling, wordless sounds of terror and panic. Tears were streaming down my face. I was shaking so bad I could barely hold onto the wheel. I kept praying to God to help me, to save me, to make it stop. But it kept coming. For what felt like forever, it chased me. Mile after mile of dark, twisting road, the woods a black blur on either side, the engine screaming, me screaming, and that thing, that monster, running beside me, keeping pace, those red eyes burning. I didn't know how long I could keep it up. I was running on pure adrenaline, pure fear. I was sure it was going to catch me, that it was going to smash through the window, pull me out, devour me. I could feel its presence, that cold, evil hunger, just inches behind me, just outside the truck. Then suddenly, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I was coming up on Hatton Road, the intersection. I remember seeing the Hatton Road sign flash in my headlights, and when I glanced in the mirror again, it was gone, just gone. 1 second it was there, running beside me, and the next, nothing. Just the dark road behind me. I didn't slow down, didn't dare to slow down. I just kept driving, kept going as fast as I could, until I hit the main highway, Route 82, and even then, I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to town, all the way to my house, and I didn't stop until I was parked in my driveway, engine off, truck silent. I sat there for a long time, just sitting in the dark, engine off, truck silent. Still shaking, still breathing hard, still terrified. I didn't move for maybe an hour, just sat there trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. It was impossible. It couldn't have happened. But it did. I saw it. I felt it. I ran from it. Finally, I managed to get out of the truck, legs wobbly and weak. I stumbled into the house, locked the door, bolted it, checked all the windows, made sure everything was locked tight. Like that would do any good against that. I went into the bedroom, collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, and just lay there, staring at the ceiling until the sun came up. Couldn't sleep. Wouldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes, burning red eyes. The next day, I went to see Mr. Abernathy, the town clerk. He's been the clerk forever, knows everyone, knows everything. He's a good man, a sensible man. I told him what happened. Everything, from beginning to end. I didn't leave anything out. I know it sounded crazy, even to me. But I had to tell someone. I had to get it out. Mr. Abernathy listened patiently, didn't interrupt. He just sat there behind his desk, listening, his face getting more and more serious as I talked. When I finished, there was a long silence. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at me, his eyes thoughtful. Then he sighed, a long, heavy sigh. "Reverend," he said finally, "that's quite a story." I braced myself. I knew what was coming. Disbelief, skepticism, maybe even mockery. I wouldn't have blamed him. It sounded insane, but he didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He didn't even say it was impossible. He just looked at me, his eyes sad and troubled. "Reverend," he said again, "you wouldn't be the first to tell me something like this." I stared at him. "What?" "Folks have seen things out on those roads before, Reverend," he said quietly. "Especially out Taylor Road. Things they can't explain. Things they don't want to talk about, but they've seen them." He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a thick, dusty ledger, opened it up, flipped through a few pages, and then stopped. He pushed the ledger across the desk towards me. "Take a look at this, Reverend." I leaned forward, looked at the page he was pointing to. It was an old record, handwritten in ink, faded with age. It was dated 1958, and the heading, "Unusual Occurrence Report, Taylor Road." I started to read. It was another account written by someone named Elias Thorne, describing an encounter on Taylor Road, late at night, driving home, and what he described, it was chillingly similar to what I had seen. A creature in the road, big, dark, hairy, red eyes, and he said it chased his wagon, back in 1958. He said it kept pace with his horse and wagon for nearly a mile before it disappeared into the woods. My blood ran cold. I looked up at Mr. Abernathy, my mouth dry. This is real?" He nodded slowly. "Something's out there, Reverend. Something's always been out there. We don't talk about it much. Folks around here, they just try to forget, but it's there." He closed the ledger, pushed it back into the drawer. "I'll make a note of your experience, Reverend, just for the record, like we always do." He wrote something in a book, another ledger, thinner, newer looking. I watched him, my mind reeling. It wasn't just me. Other people had seen it, others knew, and they were just living with it, pretending it wasn't there. But it was. It was real, and it was terrifying. I left Mr. Abernathy's office, walked back out into the daylight, but the daylight didn't feel bright anymore. The world didn't feel safe anymore. The fear was still there inside me, a cold knot in my stomach, and it's still there now. That was months ago. I still drive Taylor Road sometimes, have to get to some of the folks out that way. But I never drive it at night anymore, never, and even in the daytime I drive fast, and I'm always watching the woods, always watching the shadows, always listening for something that shouldn't be there. I don't know what it was I saw that night. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if it's still out there. All I know is I saw it. I faced it, and I survived. But something changed in me that night. Something broke. My faith. It's not the same anymore. How can it be? How can you preach about God's love and light when you've stared into eyes like that? Eyes that are nothing but cold, red, empty evil. I still go to church, still preach my sermons, still do my duty. But it's different now. I look out at my congregation on Sundays, and I wonder, how many of them know? How many of them have seen things out in these woods that they can't explain? How many of them are carrying their own silent fears, their own secret horrors? And I wonder, is it still watching? Is it still out there in the darkness, waiting for the next time someone drives down Taylor Road late at night? I don't know, and I don't want to know. I just pray I never see it again, never see those red eyes again, and I pray for anyone else who might, because once you've seen it, you can never really unsee it, and you're never really the same. I just had to tell someone, get it off my chest. Maybe someone else out there has seen something like this too. Maybe someone else knows what I'm talking about. Maybe I'm not crazy after all. But sometimes I really wonder. Sometimes, late at night when everything's quiet and dark, I can almost feel those red eyes on me again. Burning, watching. And I know deep down that it's still out there. Waiting somewhere in the dark woods beyond Taylor Road. And it will be there long after I'm gone. And that's the scariest part of all. Story 5. Okay, so this happened years ago now, back when I was a girl still living with my folks out in the sticks in Georgia. We were way outside of Boston, Georgia, not that anybody ever mistook it for the Boston up north. This was just dusty roads and pine trees and folks minding their own business. It was the late 50s, and things were slower then. Life was simpler. But sometimes simpler ain't always better, especially when it comes to things you can't explain. It started with the dogs acting up. We had these big hounds, blue and red. They weren't pretty dogs, but they were loud and protective, good for keeping critters away and letting us know if anyone was coming up the drive. They usually barked at squirrels or the mailman way down the road. Nothing much. But this night, it was different. I remember I was already in bed. Pa always made sure we went to bed early, especially in the summer when we were up with the sun doing chores. The air was thick, sticky like molasses, even with the windows open a crack. Couldn't sleep right, sheets all twisted around me, and the heat just wouldn't let up. Then the dogs started. It wasn't their usual bark, more like a frantic yelping mixed with this low growl that vibrated right through the floorboards. It was the kind of sound that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, makes you feel like something is seriously wrong. Ma stirred beside me, mumbled something about them chasing a possum again, but I knew better. This was fear in their barks, pure and simple. Pa, he sat up straight in bed. He was always a light sleeper, especially when the dogs got going. "What in tarnation is wrong with them dogs?" he said, more to himself than Ma or me. The barking got louder, more desperate. It was coming from the front porch. I remember a shiver went right down my spine. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling behind it, like they were seeing something awful. Pa swung his legs out of bed, reaching for his pants hanging over the chair. "Caleb, don't you go out there now. You don't know what's out there." Ma's voice was shaky, but Pa, he was already grabbing his shotgun from the corner. He kept it loaded, said you never know what kind of varmint might wander into the yard at night. "Stay put," he told us, voice low and serious, the kind of tone that didn't leave room for arguing. He slipped out of the bedroom, and I heard him walk heavy down the hall towards the front door. Ma sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, her eyes wide in the dim light spilling in from the moon. I held my breath, listening. The front door creaked open. The barking went up another notch, like they were right on top of whatever they were barking at. Then I heard Pa's voice, low but strained. "What in the—" It wasn't shouting, just disbelief, like he was seeing something he couldn't make sense of. And that was even scarier than the barking. My heart started hammering in my chest, felt like it was going to jump right out. I slipped out of bed, creeping to the bedroom door, Ma hissing at me to get back. I peeked out into the hallway, listening, straining to hear over the dog's racket. Then it happened. A sound that I'll never, ever forget. It wasn't human, wasn't an animal I knew. It was a growl, but deeper, way deeper than any dog, any bear. More like a rumble, a guttural sound that vibrated in the air and went right through you, making your insides clench up. It was angry, powerful, and utterly unnatural. I froze in the hallway, my blood turning to ice water. Ma gasped behind me, grabbing my arm so tight it hurt. Then Pa yelled, his voice loud and clear this time, cutting through the growling and the barking. "Martha, get back inside. Ma, stay in the bedroom. Lock the door." His voice was full of panic. I'd never heard him like that before. Then there was another sound, a heavy thud on the porch, like something massive had just shifted its weight. And then Pa yelled again, louder, his voice cracking with fear. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" That's when I screamed. Just a raw, terrified shriek that tore through the night. Ma screamed too, pulling me back into the bedroom and slamming the door shut. She fumbled with the flimsy little bolt lock, her hands shaking so bad she could barely get it to slide into place. We huddled together in the corner of the room, listening. The barking was frantic, almost hysterical now. The guttural growling was still there, closer now it seemed. I could hear Pa shouting again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was just chaos, terror, and this horrible, unearthly growl. Then the loudest sound of all, the deafening roar of Pa's shotgun. It exploded right outside the house, the flash lighting up the cracks around the bedroom door for a split second. The barking stopped, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. The growling, it changed. It wasn't as loud anymore, but it was hurt, angrier somehow, and wild. It was a sound of pure, enraged pain. Then another thud, heavier than before, then branches snapping, bushes crashing, and the sound of something big and heavy tearing through the woods behind the house. It was moving fast, whatever it was, crashing and thrashing away into the darkness. Silence descended, except for our ragged breathing and the low whimpering of the dogs somewhere outside. It was a silence thick with dread, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ma was crying silently, her hand clamped over my mouth. I was shaking so bad I could barely stand. After what felt like forever, Pa's voice, shaky now, came from outside the bedroom door. "Ma? Martha? You all right?" Ma managed to croak out, "Caleb, what was that?" He didn't answer right away. I heard him fumbling with the doorknob, unlocking it and pushing the door open slowly. He was standing there, silhouetted in the hallway light, still holding the shotgun, smoke curling from the barrel. He looked different, pale, his eyes wide and dark, like he'd seen something that had shaken him to his core. He didn't come into the room at first, just stood there, staring down the hallway towards the front door. Then he turned to us, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't know, Maggie. I don't know what it was." We went out onto the porch then, Ma and me clinging to Pa like we were afraid to let go. The dogs were huddled under the porch swing, whimpering, their tails tucked so tight between their legs they were practically invisible. They wouldn't meet our eyes, just stayed shaking and scared. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and something else, something musky and wild, like a wet animal but stronger, sharper, and wrong. It was hard to describe, but it made your nose wrinkle, your stomach turn. We looked around. There was nothing obvious at first, just the dark yard, the trees looming in the moonlight. Then Pa pointed with the shotgun barrel. "Look there." On the porch, right where we usually kept the rocking chairs, there was a mess. Splintered wood, like something had smashed into the porch railing and ripped off a chunk. And dark, thick stuff smeared on the porch boards. It wasn't blood, not like any blood I'd ever seen. Darker, almost black in places, and oily somehow. It stank, that same musky, awful smell, only stronger here. Pa knelt down, touched it with his finger, then sniffed it. He wiped his finger on his pants, his face grim. "Don't touch that, Martha," he said sharp. "Whatever it is, it ain't natural." We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled together in the living room with the lamps on full bright and the shotgun across Pa's lap. Nobody slept. We just sat there, listening to every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, jumped at every little sound. The dogs stayed under the porch, whimpering and shaking. They wouldn't come inside, wouldn't even eat the scraps Pa tried to coax them with. They were just terrified. The next morning, everything looked different in the daylight, somehow less scary. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, everything seemed normal again. But it wasn't. The smell was still faint on the porch and the dogs were still spooked. They eventually came back inside, but they were jumpy, nervous, always looking over their shoulders. Pa went out into the woods later that morning, said he was going to see if he could find anything. He was gone for hours. When he came back, he was quiet, didn't say much, just shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing but broken branches and disturbed leaves, like something big went crashing through there, but nothing." He wouldn't talk about it much after that, just said it was probably a bear or maybe a wild dog gone crazy, but I knew he didn't believe it. Ma didn't either. We both saw the look in his eyes that night, heard the fear in his voice, and I heard that growl, saw the way the dogs acted. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a dog, it was something else. And then, a few weeks later, it happened to Silas, Ma's stepfather. He lived in a little cabin deeper in the woods, even more isolated than us. He was a gruff old man, didn't scare easy, ex-military, seen a lot in his time. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters or any of that nonsense. just hard work and common sense. Ma went to visit him one afternoon, brought him some fresh bread and preserves. She came back later that day looking pale and worried. "Something happened to Silas," she said. "He's all rattled." Turns out something had woken Silas up in the middle of the night. He said he felt this presence outside his cabin, like he was being watched. He got up, grabbed his old service revolver, he always kept it loaded by his bed, and went to the window. He said it was dark out, moon hidden behind the clouds, but he could see something near the edge of the woods, just beyond his little clearing. A huge, dark shape, bigger than any man, moving around out there. He couldn't make out details, but it was big, bulky, and it gave him a bad feeling, he said, a feeling he hadn't had since the war. Silas, thinking it was some kind of prowler, maybe some kids messing around or worse, grabbed his gun and went out onto his porch. He yelled out, "Who's there? Show yourself!" Nothing, just silence and the rustling of leaves. He stepped off the porch, moved towards the edge of the clearing, gun raised. Then he saw it clearer. Standing in the shadows, just at the tree line, a massive figure, tall and dark, maybe 7 feet tall, he guessed, just standing there, still as a statue. He still thought it was a person, just a big one, maybe someone trying to scare him. He wasn't about to be intimidated. He yelled again, "I said, show yourself, I'm armed." Still nothing, just the dark shape looming there. Silas, he admitted later, started to get a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. Something about the way it stood there, silent, unmoving, just watching. He raised his revolver and fired, just one shot, right towards the dark figure. The sound echoed through the woods, loud and sharp in the quiet night. And the figure, it reacted, not like a man would. Silas said it didn't cry out, didn't fall, didn't even flinch exactly. It just moved, fast, disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness like it was never there. Silas stood there for a long time, listening, his heart pounding, his gun still raised. He didn't hear anything, just the night sounds of the woods. He went back inside, locked the door, and sat up with his gun until daylight. The next morning, he went outside to look. He didn't find blood, didn't find any sign of anyone being hit. But he did find something else. Around his cabin, especially near where he'd seen the figure standing, the ground was trampled. And in the soft earth near the trees, he found them. Footprints, not human footprints, not animal footprints he knew. Giant, bigger than his hand, almost 20 inches long, he guessed. Deep impressions like something incredibly heavy had walked there. They were not right. Like nothing he'd ever seen. He showed them to Ma when she went to visit. She came back and told Pa, her voice hushed. Pa went out to Silas's cabin, saw the footprints himself. He came back even quieter than before. Wouldn't even meet my eyes. They didn't talk about it much after that either, just whispered sometimes, late at night when they thought I was asleep, about bears, about mountain lions, about things they didn't name. But I knew what they were thinking. We all did. We never saw it again, not after that night on our porch, not at Silas's cabin, but the feeling, that stayed. The fear, the unease, the way the dogs acted, the smell on the porch, those footprints at Silas's place. It wasn't a dream. It was real. To this day, I still think about it sometimes, especially at night when the woods get dark and quiet. I hear a strange noise outside, a branch snapping, the wind rustling the leaves, and for a second, that old fear comes back, sharp and cold. I think about that growl, that smell, those dark, huge shapes in the night. I don't know what it was we saw out there. I don't know if it's still out there, in the woods, watching. I just know that something happened that night. Something real and terrifying, something that changed the way I look at the dark and the woods and the things that might be hiding in the shadows. And I'll never, ever forget it. It just stopped. Right then, like the night itself just swallowed it whole. And we were left there just wondering, and still wondering now, all these years later. Story 6. Look, I don't even know if this is the right place to share this. I found this forum online, searching for anything that made me feel less crazy, less alone in what I saw. It's been decades, but sometimes it feels like yesterday. It was 1955, Georgia, August to be exact. The kind of August where the air hangs thick and heavy, and even breathing feels like a chore. I was working forestry then, young, strong, thought I'd seen it all. Dawson County, rural as hell, nothing but woods and dirt roads as far as you could see. My job was clearing brush around these new forestry markers they were putting up. Just me, my tools, and the damn Georgia heat. That day started like any other. Up before dawn, eggs and grits for breakfast, into the old Jeep and out into the sticks. The woods were already buzzing with insects even that early. Cicadas loud enough to drown out your own thoughts, and the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, though, in that heavy southern way of being quiet. No wind, just the drone of the bugs and the occasional bird call. I was working a section near Oakey Mountain, just off some logging trail that barely qualified as a road anymore. Place was deep, felt like civilization was 100 miles away. Sun was beating down already, making the sweat pour off me. I was hacking away at some scrub oak with my machete, just trying to get a clean line around where the marker pole would go. Mind was miles away, thinking about fishing that evening, maybe heading down to the Oconee River if I got done early. Then I heard it. It wasn't loud at first, just a rustling, kind of like a deer moving through the undergrowth. But it was wrong. Too heavy, too clumsy for a deer. And the sound was coming from deeper in the woods, away from the trail. I stopped what I was doing, machete held mid-swing, listening. The cicadas still screamed, but I could hear it clearer now. A thrashing, like something big was struggling through the brush, like pushing through thick branches, snapping twigs. It wasn't rhythmic or natural, it was panicked. I thought maybe a bear or a wild hog got itself tangled in something. Curiosity, dumb curiosity, got the better of me. I figured I'd go take a look, see if an animal was in trouble, maybe help it out. Stupid looking back, really damn stupid. I pushed my way off the trail, heading towards the sound. The undergrowth was thick there, vines and briars catching at my clothes. The air felt even heavier under the tree canopy, stifling hot and close. The thrashing was getting louder as I moved, interspersed with a kind of panting, heavy, wet breaths. Still figured it was some animal in distress. Felt a little prickle of unease on the back of my neck, though. Something just didn't feel right. Then I saw it. Not all at once, but bits and pieces through the trees. First I saw movement, something big and dark shifting in the shadows. Then a glimpse of grey. Not the grey of bark, but fur. A lot of fur, and it was moving in a way that made my stomach clench. Too hunched, too low to the ground for a bear, too deliberate. I stepped out into a small clearing, and there it was, fully in view. And whatever I thought I was expecting, whatever animal I had pictured in my head, vanished. Because what I was looking at, there's no way to describe it that makes any goddamn sense. It was standing sort of upright, maybe 6 feet tall, but hunched over like it was more comfortable on all fours. Covered head to toe in this thick, matted fur, the color of dirty ash. Not like animal fur I'd ever seen, though. It looked coarse, almost like human hair, but thicker, wilder, and it was moving, kind of shimmering, even though there wasn't any breeze, like it was alive, separate from the creature itself. Its face, or where its face should have been. It was a mess. Hard to make out any features under all that hair, but there were eyes. I saw those. Deep set, dark, and they reflected the light in a way that sent a bolt of ice down my spine. They weren't animal eyes. They were aware, intelligent in a way that felt ancient and cold. And the smell, Christ, the smell. It hit me like a wall, like rotten meat and wet dog, mixed with something else, something acrid and sickeningly sweet. made my eyes water, bile rising in my throat. It was tearing at something on the ground, something dark and shapeless. I couldn't make out what it was, and honestly, I didn't want to. The sound of its tearing, wet, ripping sounds, mixed with those heavy, ragged breaths, it was nightmarish. For a long, frozen moment, we just stared at each other. Me, standing there dumbstruck with my machete in hand, and it just watching me with those black, depthless eyes. It stopped tearing at whatever it was and slowly straightened up, still hunched but taller now, looming. And the hair, it seemed to bristle, to stand on end all over its body. That's when the real fear hit. Not just unease or surprise, but pure primal terror. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get the hell away from that thing. My hand tightened on the machete, not because I thought I could fight it, but because it was the only thing solid and real in a world that had suddenly gone completely insane. It took a step towards me, slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking prey. And it made a sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but a kind of whimper, low, guttural and chillingly human-like. But twisted, wrong, like something trying to mimic a human sound, but failing horribly. That was it. Something snapped in my head. Fight or flight, flight, no question. I turned and ran. I didn't even think, didn't look back, just ran. Pushed through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my skin. I could hear it behind me, not running, not in the way I was running, but moving, fast. Branches snapping, underbrush crashing, that heavy breathing getting closer. My lungs burned, legs ached, but I kept going. Towards the trail, towards the jeep, towards anything that meant getting away from that thing. I stumbled, fell once, scrambled back up, adrenaline pumping like ice water through my veins. I could hear it gaining on me, closer, closer. The smell was stronger now, thick and cloying in my nostrils. I broke out of the trees, back onto the logging trail. The jeep, bless it, was right there. Just a few yards. Salvation. I sprinted for it, fumbling for the door handle, desperate to get inside, to lock myself in, to put metal and glass between me and whatever was chasing me. Just as my hand touched the handle, it hit me. A blow to my shoulder, hard enough to knock me sideways. Pain exploded through my arm, sharp and searing. I cried out, stumbling, turning around to face it. It was right there. Taller now, impossibly tall, looming over me. Those grey furred arms reached for me, and I saw them then, the claws. Long, black, wickedly sharp, extending from its grey, almost human-like hands. It swiped again. Claws raked across my chest, tearing through my shirt, burning lines of agony across my skin. I yelled again, a raw, animal sound of pure terror and pain. I flailed with the machete, swung wildly, blindly, just trying to keep it away. The blade connected with something solid, maybe its arm, I don't know. Didn't seem to even register with it. It was on me now, close, so close I could feel its hot, fetid breath on my face. Those eyes, those black, knowing eyes, were inches from mine. And that whimper again, low and hungry, right in my ear. I could see its teeth now, yellowed and pointed, snapping at the air. I pushed, shoved, fought with every ounce of strength I had left. Managed to get an arm between us, push against its chest, trying to create space, trying to breathe. It stumbled back a step, just enough. And in that split second, I lunged for the jeep door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. Slammed the door, fumbled for the lock, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I scrambled across the seat, reached for the ignition, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. Turned the key, engine coughed, sputtered, finally roared to life. I slammed the jeep into gear, foot down on the gas, tires spitting gravel as I lurched forward, back down the trail. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. Couldn't. Didn't want to see if it was still there, still chasing. Just kept my foot down, bouncing and careening down that rutted track, branches scraping against the sides of the jeep, engine screaming. I drove like a maniac, faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping, not slowing down, just driving. Didn't stop until I burst out onto the main road, asphalt smooth and blessedly solid under my tires. Then I slowed down, pulled over to the side of the road, and just sat there, engine idling, shaking all over, gasping for breath. My shoulder and chest were on fire. I looked down. My shirt was ripped to shreds, blood soaking through, deep gashes across my chest, bleeding freely, shoulder throbbing, felt like it was dislocated, but I was alive. I was out. I sat there for a long time, just trying to get my breathing under control, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Tried to tell myself it was a bear, a big freak bear, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. That wasn't a bear, that was something else, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. Eventually, I managed to get myself moving again. Drove back to Dawson, straight to Doc Henderson's office. He patched me up, didn't ask too many questions, just figured I'd had a run-in with a wild animal. I let him think that. Couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. Didn't think anyone would believe me anyway. That evening, back home, I cleaned my wounds, tried to scrub the smell of that thing off my skin, off my clothes. Couldn't. The smell lingered, a phantom stench that clung to me for days. Slept with a rifle by my bed that night. Didn't sleep much. Just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, seeing those black eyes in my mind. I didn't go back to those woods. Told my foreman I wasn't feeling well. Took a few days off. Then asked for a different assignment, away from Oaky Mountain, away from those trees. They gave it to me. Didn't ask questions. Maybe they saw something in my eyes. The story, well, it got around like things do in small towns. People started talking about it. Whispers, rumors, stories passed around at the general store, the diner. Someone mentioned seeing something out near Oaky Mountain, something strange. Someone else chimed in, heard tell of a creature. They called it the hairy phantom of Dawson. Just local folklore, they said, scary stories to tell around a campfire. But I knew what I saw, what I felt. The fear, that real bone-deep fear, it stayed with me. Still does sometimes, especially in the quiet of the woods, especially at night. I'll never forget those eyes, never forget that smell. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, or maybe it's just my imagination, but sometimes I swear I can still hear that rustling in the woods, that heavy breathing, and that low, whimpering sound. And I know it's still out there. Somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting, and I'll never, ever go back to Oaky Mountain, never. And you know the worst part? The part that chills me to the bone even now, all these years later? When I think back on its face, on those eyes, sometimes, just sometimes, I get this horrible feeling, like it wasn't just looking at me, like it was looking through me, like it knew something I didn't, something terrible. And that's what truly scares me, because I still have no idea what it was, or why it was there, or what it wanted. And I probably never will. Story 7. The sun was beating down something fierce that day, like Georgia in July always does. I remember that sweat stinging my eyes as I pushed the mower back and forth across the field, the drone of the engine kind of numbing after a while. Just the smell of cut grass and the buzzing heat. My grandpa had this old patch of land behind his house, always needed tending to, and it was my job that summer. I didn't mind it too much usually. Kind of got lost in the rhythm of it, just me and the mower and the field stretching out in front. This field backed right up to the woods, thick woods too, the kind you didn't want to go wandering into unless you had a good reason. Always felt like they were watching, even on a bright day. Anyway, I was on my third or fourth pass, nearing the edge of the tree line, when something caught my eye. It wasn't a noise or anything like that, just a flicker of movement. Peripheral vision stuff, you know. I cut the engine for a second, thinking it was maybe a deer or a stray dog, something normal. The sudden quiet felt heavy after the mower's roar, just birds chirping, crickets maybe, the usual background noise you don't really notice until it's quiet. And then I saw it again, closer to the woods, moving along the fence line that separated the field from the trees. It was small, real small. At first I thought maybe it was a kid. You get kids wandering everywhere out here, but it moved wrong. Lower to the ground, kind of hunched over, and it was covered in hair, like not just wearing a jacket, but actually covered in thick, matted-looking hair. My first thought, I'm not even kidding, was a bear cub, even though I knew it wasn't bear season and cubs aren't usually alone. But that was the first animal my mind jumped to because of the fur. I squinted, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm, trying to get a better look. It was moving slowly, kind of stumbling more than walking, and it stayed right along that fence line, like it was following it. I pushed the mower a bit closer, curiosity getting the better of me. I needed to see what the heck it was. As I got nearer, the details started coming into focus, and whatever animal I thought it was before just vanished. This wasn't any animal I recognized. It was small, like maybe 3 feet tall, and yeah, it was covered head to toe in this shaggy off-white fur. Not clean white, more like dirty snow. And the way it moved, jerky, uneven, like its limbs weren't quite working right together. It was hunched over, head down, and I couldn't see its face, just this matted curtain of fur hanging down. I killed the engine completely this time, the silence pressing in now. The birds seemed to have quieted too, and that felt off, like the whole field was holding its breath. The only sound was the low hum in my ears, and my own heart starting to thump a little faster. I watched it for maybe a minute, frozen, just trying to understand what I was looking at. It wasn't making any noise, no snuffling or panting or anything, just this silent, hairy thing shuffling along the fence. It stopped right at the edge of the woods, where the fence line kind of disappears into the undergrowth. It just stood there, still hunched over, facing the woods. That's when I started feeling really uneasy. It was the stillness, maybe, and the way it was facing the woods, like it was waiting for something, or listening to something I couldn't hear. I took a step back, just instinctively, and the gravel crunched under my boots. Instantly, its head snapped up. I saw its face then, and I wish I hadn't. It wasn't a human face, not really. But it wasn't animal either, not like any animal I knew. The fur was thinner around its face, more like wiry hair, and the skin underneath looked pale, almost translucent. Its eyes were what got me. Big black eyes that seemed to swallow the light, and they were wide, fixed on me in a way that sent a shiver right down my spine. Not just fear, but something colder, something wrong. Its nose was flat, almost like it didn't have one, just 2 slits. And its mouth, it was just a dark, thin line, barely visible in the fur. But it was pulled back slightly, and I could see teeth. Not animal teeth, not really. More like human teeth, but too many, and too sharp, and too small. Like a child's teeth, but twisted and wrong. It just stared at me. No expression, no blinking, just those black eyes boring into me. And in that silence, I felt this wave of pure, unadulterated fear wash over me. Not like being scared by a dog barking or seeing a spider. This was deeper, primal, like my body was screaming at me to run. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, staring at each other across the field. Felt like forever. Then it moved again. Slowly, deliberately, it started to straighten up. Not all the way, still hunched, but it gained maybe another foot of height. And as it straightened, I saw its hands, or what I guess were its hands. They were small, almost like doll's hands, with long, thin fingers that ended in claws. Not big, tearing claws like a bear, but sharp, curved claws, like a bird of prey. And they were white, like bone, sticking out from the fur. It took a step towards me, just one step, slow and deliberate. And that was it. That was when my brain finally kicked in and screamed, "Run!" I didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't even grab my water bottle that was sitting on the mower. I just turned and ran. I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life, back across the field towards the house. The mower was behind me, forgotten, the strange creature at the edge of the woods, and all I could think about was getting away. I didn't look back. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my lungs burning, my legs pumping like pistons. I burst through the back door of the house, slamming it shut behind me and fumbling with the lock, even though I knew whatever that thing was probably wasn't going to follow me right into my grandpa's kitchen. Grandpa was in the living room watching TV, and he looked up, startled, when I came crashing in. "Tant, what in the world?" I was panting too hard to speak for a second, just trying to catch my breath. "Something in the field. Woods," I gasped, pointing back towards the field. He looked at me, his eyebrows furrowed. "Something in the field? What are you talking about? You see a snake?" "No, not a snake," I said, finally getting my breath back enough to talk. I don't know what it was, small, hairy creature by the woods." Grandpa got up, walked over to the window and looked out towards the field. "I don't see anything, Tant. You probably just saw a raccoon or something." "Grandpa, it wasn't a raccoon," I insisted, my voice shaking a little. It stood up. It had claws, and its face. It was weird." He kept looking out the window for a minute, then turned back to me, his expression softening a little. All right, let's go take a look. Maybe a stray dog got out of the neighbors again." He got his shotgun from the closet, the old double barrel he used for varmints, and we went back outside. I was hesitant, but I didn't want him to think I was making things up. We walked down to the edge of the field together, Grandpa in front with the shotgun, me trailing behind, still jumpy and looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The sun was still blazing hot, the field was still quiet, the mower was still sitting where I left it, engine dead, grass clippings scattered around. But there was nothing else, no creature, no sign of anything unusual, just the field and the woods and the hot, still afternoon. Grandpa walked around for a bit, peering into the tree line, calling out, here, boy," like he was calling a dog. But there was nothing. He shook his head, then put his hand on my shoulder. "See, Tant? Probably just spooked yourself over nothing. It's hot out here. Maybe you're a little dehydrated. Come on, let's go get some lemonade." I knew he didn't believe me, but I didn't push it. What could I say? "Grandpa, I saw a 3-foot-tall hairy monster with claws and black eyes." He would have thought I'd finally lost it in the summer heat. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it wasn't a raccoon or a dog or anything normal, and the feeling of fear, that cold, primal fear, stayed with me all day. Later that evening, after dinner, I was still jumpy, kept looking out the windows towards the woods. Grandpa noticed and sat me down, looking serious. "Tant, look," he said. "I know you think you saw something, and maybe you did, but out here, in the country, sometimes your mind plays tricks on you, especially in the heat. Don't let it get to you, you hear? Just forget about it, and we'll finish mowing that field tomorrow morning." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't forget about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those black eyes staring at me, those tiny claws, that silent, hunched figure at the edge of the woods. The next day, we went back out to finish mowing. Grandpa insisted on coming with me, which I appreciated, even though he pretended it was just to keep me company. He had the shotgun again, leaning it against the tractor. We mowed the rest of the field, getting closer to the woods this time, and I was on edge the whole time, scanning the tree line, expecting to see it again. We didn't. Nothing. The woods were just woods, silent and still. We finished mowing, packed up, and went back to the house. Grandpa clapped me on the back. "See? Nothing to worry about. Just your imagination running wild." But that wasn't the end of it. That evening, I went into town with Grandpa to pick up some groceries. Edison is small, real small. Everyone knows everyone. And people were talking, whispering, looking at me a little funny. At the gas station, old Mrs. Henderson, who runs the local gossip mill, gave me this knowing look and leaned in, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Tant, honey, you all right? Heard you had a bit of a scare out at your grandpa's yesterday." I just mumbled something about a raccoon, trying to play it down. But she just smiled knowingly. "Uh-huh, a raccoon. Well, you just be careful out there, you hear? Folks been seeing things out in the woods lately. Strange things." Then, at the grocery store, I saw a couple of guys pointing at me and whispering, and one of them, I think it was Billy Ray's boy, even chuckled. It was weird, uncomfortable, like everyone knew something I didn't know they knew, or knew more than I was saying. The next morning, it was in the paper, the Edison County Weekly. Right there on the front page, under a ridiculous headline, "Monster Sighting Terrorizes Local Youth." I grabbed the paper, heart sinking, and started reading. It was all about me, Tant King, local boy, attacked by a monstrous creature in the woods behind his grandpa's property. They described this thing as a hairy white beast over 5 feet tall, with razor-sharp claws, pointed ears and fangs like a man's fingers. It said it had chased me through the fields, roaring, leaving massive paw prints with 4 curved claws. They even had a local expert, some guy who claimed to be a cryptozoologist from out of state, speculating about the origins of the Edison monster. I just stared at the paper, my jaw dropped. 5 feet tall, fangs, roaring, paw prints. This was insane. This wasn't what I saw, not even close. Mine was small, silent, almost fragile looking in a way, not this monstrous beast they were describing. I showed the article to Grandpa, and he just sighed and shook his head. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "They've really gone and done it now." He wasn't mad, just resigned, like he'd seen this kind of thing before. And then he said something that chilled me to the bone. "You know, Tant," he said quietly, looking out the window, "back when I was a boy, folks used to talk about something out in these woods. Never saw it myself. Always figured it was just stories. But maybe there's something to it after all. And that's it. That's my story. To this day, people in Edison still talk about the Edison monster. They still look at me funny when I go into town. The boy who saw the monster." The newspaper article got reprinted in those weird Believe It or Not magazines, and online you can probably still find blurry photos people claim are the Edison monster. Spoiler, they're just dogs or raccoons or blurry nothing. But me, I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a monster, not in the way they describe it, but it was something else, something unnatural, something small and silent and terrifying in its own way. And I still see those black eyes when I close mine sometimes. I still feel that cold fear, that primal dread. I never went back to mow that field by myself again. And every time I drive past those woods, I still get a shiver. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. But I know I saw something that day in the field, and I know, deep down, that some things are better left unseen, lurking in the shadows at the edge of the woods, silent and watching. And that newspaper story, the monster they described, that wasn't it. Not really. Mine was smaller, quieter. And in some ways, that made it even more terrifying. Because it felt real. Too real. And sometimes, when I'm out late at night, and the woods are really quiet, I swear, I can almost still hear nothing. Just that unnerving silence, and the feeling of being watched. And I wonder if it's still out there. Waiting. Story 8. I used to go camping a lot, back when my old dog Buster was still around. He was a Boston Terrier, small but tough as nails, and usually fearless. We'd go out to the mountains in western NC all the time, just to get away from Charlotte, you know, get some quiet. This one time it was fall, maybe late October. The leaves were turning, air was crisp, perfect camping weather. I picked a spot I hadn't been to before, near a creek deep in the South Mountains, figured it would be secluded, and I was right. Got there in the late afternoon, set up camp, got a fire going, you know, the usual. Buster was sniffing around, happy as could be, chasing leaves, typical dog stuff. As it started getting dark, we were just sitting by the fire, me with a beer, him gnawing on a stick he'd found. Everything was peaceful, quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I don't know when exactly it started, but Buster started acting strange. He perked up his ears, real tense, like he'd heard something. Then he got up and started pacing around the edge of the firelight, growling low in his throat. Buster never growled at anything in the woods. He was usually just curious and maybe bark at squirrels. But this was different. This was a deep, serious growl. I tried to calm him down, told him it was just probably a deer or something, but he wouldn't listen. He kept staring out into the woods, towards the tree line, and his growls were getting louder, more frantic. Then he started barking, not his usual yap, 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 but these low, guttural barks, almost like whimpers mixed in. It was unnerving as hell because Buster wasn't scared of anything. Seriously, he'd chase after bigger dogs, squirrels, you name it. But he was scared now. I could see it. He suddenly backed up right up to me, nudging into my leg and whimpering, tail tucked so far under he looked like a turtle. He just sat there, pressed against me, staring into the dark woods, trembling. That's when I started to feel it too, that cold, prickling feeling on the back of your neck, you know, like something's watching you and it's not good. I scanned around, trying to see what had spooked him. It was getting properly dark now, just the firelight cutting through the blackness. The trees were all twisted shapes in the shadows. And then I saw it. Or I thought I saw something. Movement. Over by the tree line, where the woods got really dense and dark, there was something shifting. It was hard to make out at first, just shadows moving within shadows. I squinted, trying to focus, and then it started to take shape. Slowly. It was like something was rising up from the ground, or maybe it was crouched down low behind the trees, and it was just standing up now. It was big, way bigger than any deer, way bigger than a bear. It was tall and bulky. As it stood taller, I started to get a better look at it, and my blood just ran cold. This thing, it wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I knew. It was like something out of a nightmare. It was covered in dark fur, matted and thick like bear fur, but darker, almost black. It was massive, just huge, wide shoulders, thick arms and legs. But the way it moved was weird. Not quite like a bear, not like anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't walking upright completely, more like a slouching, lumbering walk. And the size. It kept getting taller. I swear, as it straightened up, it must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was just enormous and wide, like a wall of muscle and fur. There was no neck to speak of. Its head just seemed to sit right on top of those massive shoulders. The air got heavy, thick, and the smell hit me then. God, the smell, like something dead, rotting meat, and something else, musky, rank, like an animal that hadn't bathed in weeks. It was sickening, made my stomach clench. Buster started whining louder, digging his claws into my jeans. Then it made a noise, a low growl at first, deep in its chest, like a rumbling, but it wasn't like any animal growl I'd ever heard. It was deeper, throatier. And then it changed. It rose in pitch, turned into a howl. Not a wolf howl, nothing like that. This was inhuman. It started low and then just went screaming up like a train whistle, but corrupted, distorted. It was piercing, made my ears ring, and it vibrated right through my bones. It was the most horrifying sound I've ever heard. It wasn't just scary, it was wrong. Like something unnatural was making that noise, something that shouldn't exist. My mind was racing. Bear, too big, wrong shape, wrong smell, wrong sound, mountain lion? Definitely not. This thing was massive, way bigger. I didn't know what the hell it was. My brain just kept screaming, monster. Fear, pure, cold terror just washed over me. I was frozen, staring at this thing, just standing there at the edge of the woods, half in shadow, half in the firelight, this monstrous shape, this stench, this ungodly howl still echoing in my ears. My hand went instinctively to my rifle. My Winchester 30-30, always kept it in the tent loaded when I camped in bear country. Never thought I'd need it for this. I grabbed it, brought it up, shaking. My hands were clammy, grip slipping. I aimed it more or less in the direction of this creature. It was just standing there, still, hulking, staring, I think. I couldn't see its eyes clearly in the dim light, but I felt like it was looking right at me, through me, and then it started to move, not towards me, away. It turned slowly, deliberately, and started to lumber back into the trees, into the dark. It was like it was saying, "I've shown myself, now I'm leaving." But the terror of seeing it, the smell, that sound, it was still raw, overwhelming. Something in me just snapped. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was just plain stupidity, maybe it was just wanting to do something, anything to break the spell of pure terror. Before I even thought about it, before any reason kicked in, my finger tightened on the trigger. Boom! The rifle bucked in my hands, the sound deafening in the quiet woods. The fire flared up from the muzzle flash, throwing light out into the trees for a split second. The creature, it stumbled. Just for a moment. It didn't fall, didn't collapse, but it definitely reacted. It let out another sound, not the howl this time, more like a roar, but laced with pain and rage. It was shorter, sharper, but even more terrifying. A wounded animal sound, but magnified, monstrous. It turned its head back towards me, just for a heartbeat, and I could see something. A glint of eye. Then it was gone. It turned fully and crashed into the trees. I heard branches snapping, undergrowth crunching as it moved away, deeper and deeper into the woods. The sounds faded, quicker than I expected, swallowed by the night. Then, silence. Except for the crackling fire and my own ragged breathing. And Buster's whimpering, still pressed against me. I stood there, rifle still raised, shaking like a leaf. The smell was still in the air, fainter now, but still there, that rotten, musky stench. My ears were ringing from the gunshot, and the silence after the creature was gone was heavy, oppressive. I lowered the rifle slowly, my arm feeling weak. I looked out into the trees, into the blackness where it had disappeared. Nothing, just shadows, silence. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Had I just imagined it all? The fear, the smell, the sound. It had all been so real, too real. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there, fire burning down, Buster trembling, listening to the silence, broken only by the creek rushing nearby. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like it was coming back. Finally, I forced myself to move. I got more wood for the fire, built it back up, made it as big and bright as I could. I dragged Buster into the tent, zipped it shut tight, got my sleeping bag, laid down with the rifle next to me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every creak of a branch, every hoot of an owl, every rustle in the leaves made me jump. I kept seeing that thing in my mind, that hulking shape, those dark eyes, that horrible smell, that sound. It was burned into my memory. As soon as it was light enough, not even properly dawn yet, just grey light filtering through the trees, I packed up camp. Fast. I threw everything into the car, didn't even bother to clean up properly, just got out of there. Buster was still skittish, wouldn't leave my side. Drove all the way back to Charlotte without stopping. Didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, doors locked, curtains drawn. Felt safer inside walls, but still, that feeling, that cold dread, it lingered. I never went back to that spot. Never went back to the South Mountains. In fact, I haven't been camping alone in the woods since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will again. I told a couple of people about it, tried to explain what I saw, what I heard, what I smelled. They just looked at me like I was crazy. Bear, probably just a bear, they'd say, or you were probably just spooked. Woods play tricks on you at night. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But Buster didn't imagine it. He saw it too. He smelled it too. He was terrified, and he was never scared of anything. And I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. I know what I heard. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything natural. And to this day, sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, I still catch that smell. Faint, but there. Rotten and musky. And sometimes, just for a second, I swear I hear it. That sound. That unholy howl echoing in the dark. And I'm right back there in the woods, staring into the shadows, feeling that cold, primal fear again. It's like it's never really left me, like a shadow in the corner of my eye, always just out of sight, but always there. Story 9. Okay, so where do I even start with this? It's not something you just bring up in normal conversation, you know? Like, hey, how's your day? Oh, just saw a headless thing in the woods a while back, no biggie. Yeah, people look at you like you've lost your mind, but I gotta tell someone who might actually understand, or at least not completely dismiss it. Because it happened. It really happened. It was back in '72. I was a volunteer deputy back then in Drexel, North Carolina. Small town, real small. Mostly farms and woods, you know the kind of place. Things were quieter then, especially at night. I was riding with Roy Eberhardt, sheriff's deputy, solid guy. Older than me, seen a bit more. We were just doing routine patrol, late shift. Probably around 11 or so, maybe a bit later. It was a clear night, moon was out, not full, but enough to see. We were driving on this back road, one of those roads that just snakes through the trees, barely any houses around. Dirt road mostly, gravel in some spots. We were just talking, mostly about, well, I don't even remember now, just regular stuff. He might have been telling a joke or complaining about paperwork, something normal like that. We had the windows down. It was that kind of cool night air, smell of pine and damp earth. Peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. And then it happened. We were coming around a bend, not fast, maybe 25, 30 tops. And I saw something move in the shadows on the side of the road, just a flicker of movement, enough to catch my eye. I remember nudging Roy, pointing, just saying, "Did you see that?" He slowed the car right down, coasting almost. And that's when we both saw it. It wasn't like anything either of us could have imagined. At first, it just looked like a big, dark shape moving across the road up ahead. It was coming from the woods on the right side, moving across to the other woods on the left. It was dark out there, even with the moon, real dark under the trees, but this thing was darker, like it sucked the light out of the air around it. It was tall. God, it was tall. Taller than any man, taller than Roy, and he was a big fella, and it was just a silhouette. But it wasn't the silhouette of a bear or a deer or any animal we knew. It was humanoid, kinda, but all wrong. As it got closer to the middle of the road, where the moonlight hit better, we could make out more detail, if you can even call it detail. It was like someone had draped a huge dark coat over something, and it wasn't moving like a person in a coat. It was lumbering, I guess is the word. Slow but deliberate. Heavy. And the weirdest part, the part that makes my skin crawl even now just thinking about it, there was no head, just shoulders that went straight up, like the coat was just hanging from nothing above the neck. It was like the space where a head should be was just empty darkness, not even shadowed, just gone, like it wasn't supposed to be there. We both just froze. The car was still rolling a bit, silent. Neither of us said a word. We just watched this thing cross the road. It took its time. It wasn't running. It wasn't hurrying. It was like it knew we were there, but it just didn't care. Or maybe it didn't even see us. I don't know. It looked like it was wearing something dark and shaggy, like fur, but not like any fur I've ever seen on an animal around here. Denser, thicker, darker, and it moved like it was heavy, like it weighed a ton. It wasn't graceful. It was just there, moving. And the height, I keep coming back to the height. It had to be at least 6 feet tall, maybe more, just this huge, shapeless, headless, dark mass moving across the road in front of us. We just stared. I don't think either of us even breathed for a while there. It felt like time stopped. Everything went quiet, except for the crickets chirping in the woods. And even they sounded muffled, like they knew something was wrong. Like they were holding their breath too. Then Roy, he finally snapped out of it a little. He put the car in park, slowly, carefully. He didn't say anything, he just reached for the spotlight. The big one on the side of the car. He flipped it on, and bam! That beam of light cut right through the darkness and hit the thing. It had just reached the edge of the woods on the other side of the road. And when the spotlight hit it, it stopped. Just stopped dead, and it turned. Slowly, deliberately, it turned towards us. Even now, talking about it, it's hard to explain what that was like. To see that dark, headless shape turn and face you. The light was shining right on it, and it was just more of the same. No eyes to reflect the light, no face to react. Just nothing, where a head should have been. Just that dark, shaggy coat, whatever it was. It didn't rush us, it didn't make any noise. It just stood there, facing us in the beam of the spotlight. And in that light it looked wronger, somehow. The shagginess of the coat, or whatever it was, seemed coarser, more unnatural. Like it wasn't fur, but something else. Something you shouldn't see on something even vaguely human-shaped. We were both paralyzed. Terror, pure and simple. It wasn't like being scared of a bear or a wild dog. This was something else entirely, something fundamentally wrong with the world, something that should not exist. Then, just as suddenly as it stopped, it moved again. It didn't run, it didn't jump. It just turned away from the light and walked into the woods, slowly, heavily, back into the darkness under the trees. And it just disappeared, vanished into the shadows like it had never been there. Roy killed the spotlight. We were just sitting there in the patrol car, in the dark again, just the moonlight coming through the trees. Silent, completely silent, except for my heart, which was pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. I could hear Roy breathing heavy next to me. Finally, after what felt like forever, Roy turned the ignition back on. He put the car in gear, but he didn't move. He just sat there idling. Then he said, in this voice that was kind of shaky, like he was trying to keep it together, Did you see that, David?" And all I could do was nod. I couldn't even speak. My throat was too tight. My mouth was dry. I just nodded. He said it again, louder this time, almost like he needed to hear himself say it out loud to make it real. "David, did you see that? What in God's name was that?" I finally managed to croak out, I don't know, Roy. I honestly don't know." And that was the truth. I had no idea what we had just seen. None. It didn't make any sense. We sat there for a few more minutes, just staring out at the woods where it had disappeared. Neither of us wanted to get out of the car. Neither of us wanted to go looking. We just wanted to get out of there. Eventually, Roy put the car in drive and we moved on. Slowly. We didn't talk much for the rest of the shift. We finished our patrol, but we were both different. Something had changed. Something had been broken in a way, like we'd seen behind the curtain of what's normal, and what was behind it was horrifying. When we got back to the station, it was almost dawn. We signed off, and I just went home. I didn't even say goodnight to Roy properly. I just wanted to get away, to get home, to pretend it hadn't happened. But it did. And you can't just unsee something like that. The next day, I asked Roy about it. He was quieter than usual. He told me he hadn't slept well. Neither had I. We talked about what we saw, tried to make sense of it. We went over every animal it could have been, every explanation. A bear? No, too tall, wrong shape and no head. A person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. Wearing that? It just didn't fit. None of it fit. Roy, he was a sheriff's deputy. He was supposed to be rational, grounded. But even he couldn't explain it. He kept shaking his head, saying, "I don't know, David. I just don't know." Word got around town, of course. Small town gossip, you know how it is. Someone must have seen us out on that road late at night and figured something was up. Rumors started flying. Whispers about something out in the woods. People started calling the station, asking questions, scared people. And that's when the pressure started. The sheriff, he wanted it to go away. Didn't want the town panicked. Didn't want the bad publicity. He called Roy and me into his office. He was not happy. He basically told Roy, as the senior deputy, that we needed to come up with a reasonable explanation. Something people would accept. He didn't say it outright, but he made it clear. The headless thing never happened. We were mistaken. We saw something else. Roy, he was a good man, but he also knew how things worked. He had a family to feed, a job to keep. And the sheriff, he wasn't asking. He was telling. So Roy went along with it. He told people it was a bear. Yeah, a bear. And the headless part? He said it was just the shadows and the way the moonlight hit it. He said maybe it had its head down, or it was obscured by something. A bear with a dark, shaggy coat. It was ridiculous. We both knew it was ridiculous. But it was the story we were supposed to stick to. And people, well, most people wanted to believe it. They wanted a simple explanation. A bear. Okay, a bear. Scary, but understandable. Better than whatever we actually saw. But some people, they didn't buy it. They saw the look in our eyes, I guess. They knew something was wrong, and the rumors kept going. People started talking about the woolly booger, some old local legend, some kind of creature in the woods. I'd heard the stories before. Everyone in Drexel had. Just local folklore, spooky tales to tell kids around a campfire. Never took it seriously, until that night. After that night, the woolly booger didn't seem like just a story anymore. It felt real, like we'd actually seen it. Like those old stories weren't just stories after all. Roy, he never really talked about it again after that. He'd shut down whenever it came up. I think it bothered him, having to lie about it, having to pretend it was just a bear, but he did what he had to do. And eventually, the buzz died down. People moved on, or pretended to move on, but I didn't. I couldn't. Every time I drive down those back roads at night, I still think about it. I still look at the shadows at the edge of the woods. I still see that shape in my mind. Headless, dark, unnatural. I don't know what we saw that night. I have no explanation. And honestly, I don't think I want one. Some things are better left unexplained. Some things you just see, and they change you. They change the way you look at the world. And you can never really go back to the way things were before. I haven't told this story to many people, not really, not like this, too scared of being laughed at or dismissed. But maybe someone out there has seen something like it too. Maybe someone understands. Maybe I'm not completely crazy after all. Maybe there's just things out there we don't understand, things we're not meant to understand. And sometimes they cross your path on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. And you just have to live with that, with the knowing that the world is a stranger, scarier place than you ever thought possible. And you're never really alone in the dark. Never again. Story 10. We had these storms back then, real gully washers. The kind that knock out the power and leave you sitting in the dark, listening to the wind howl and the trees crack. This particular night, it was one of those. Rain was coming down sideways, slapping against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind was screaming like a banshee, and every now and then there'd be a flash of lightning that lit up everything outside in these spooky, stark whites. I was in bed trying to sleep, but the storm was keeping me jumpy. My wife, Martha, was already out like a light. Always could sleep through anything, that woman. Me. I was wide awake, just staring up at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the house creak and groan in the wind. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks. But it was different, a noise I'd never heard before, not from the wind, not from the rain, not from anything natural. It was sort of a shuffling, scraping sound, like something heavy was dragging itself across the porch. My heart started to thump a little harder in my chest. I figured it might just be a branch that had fallen off a tree, or maybe some trash cans blowing around. But it was persistent, this sound. Kept going and going, shuffling closer. I got out of bed, quiet as I could, and went to the window in the living room. We had these old wooden blinds, you know, with slats you could tilt open a little bit to peek out. I crept up to the window and slowly, carefully angled the slats just enough to see out onto the porch. And that's when I saw it. Or, well, part of it. The porch light was flickering, going dim every now and then, making everything jumpy and shadowy. But even with that, I could see enough. There was this shape, right up against the side of the house near the window. It was big, way bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, and it was hunched over, like it was trying to, I don't know, get closer to the house. I couldn't make out details at first, just this huge, dark mass. My breath caught in my throat. I froze solid, staring at it through those little cracks in the blinds. Then the porch light flickered again, and for a split second it flared up bright. And I saw it clearer. It was monstrous. That's the only word for it. It wasn't like anything I could describe from real life. It was too big, for one thing. And the way it moved, it wasn't like an animal. It was wrong. Just fundamentally wrong. It was bulky, like a distorted man, but way bigger and all lumpy, if that makes sense. Like parts of it were swollen or just misplaced. I saw an arm, thick as my leg, with these things sticking out of it like knobs or I don't know what. And the skin, it looked slick and dark, almost black and sort of wet-looking, even in the rain. It was close to the window now, so close I could almost feel the wrongness of it just radiating off it. I could hear it breathing, this heavy, wet, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. And there was a smell, too, faint at first, but then it got stronger. A sickly, sweet, rotten smell, like something had died and been left out in the sun too long. Terror, pure and simple terror, just clamped down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I thought it would burst. I just stood there, staring at this thing, pressed up against my house, outside my window. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen like that. Felt like forever. But finally, something snapped in me. I couldn't just stand there and watch whatever this was. I had to do something. I backed away from the window, slow and quiet, like if I made any noise it would hear me, even through the walls. I went into the bedroom, shaking Martha awake. "Martha," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Martha, wake up. Something's outside. Something bad." She grumbled and rolled over, but I shook her harder. "Martha, please, you gotta wake up. I saw something. Something on the porch. It's not right." She finally blinked her eyes open, looking at me blurry and confused. "Homer, what in the world? What's wrong?" "There's something outside, Martha," I said, my voice trembling now. "I don't know what it is, but it's monstrous. We need to get Jebediah." Jebediah was our neighbor, lived just down the road. Big, strong fella, always had been. And he owned a shotgun, a double-barreled thing he used for hunting. I figured if anything could help us, it'd be Jebediah and his shotgun. Martha was finally starting to understand I wasn't just having a nightmare. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide. "What did you see, Homer? What was it?" "I don't know, Martha," I said. I don't know. But it's bad, real bad. Come on." We threw on some clothes as fast as we could, not even bothering to turn on the lights. Every creak of the floorboard sounded deafening in the storm. I grabbed my old hunting rifle from the closet, never thought I'd ever need to use it for anything like this. We crept out the back door, staying low, and ran through the yard toward Jebediah's place. The rain was soaking us to the bone, and the wind was still howling like mad. But we didn't care. We just needed to get to Jebediah. We pounded on his door, yelling his name, until finally a light flickered on inside, and Jebediah opened the door, looking bleary-eyed and annoyed. He was wearing his long johns and had his hair all messed up. "Homer? Martha? What in the blazes?" he started to say, but I cut him off. "Jebediah, we need your help," I said, panting. "There's something on my porch. It's a monster, Jebediah, a real monster." Jebediah stared at me for a second, like he thought I'd gone crazy. Then he saw the look on my face and on Martha's. He saw the fear in our eyes. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, turned around and grabbed his shotgun off the wall. "Let's go see what's got Homer so riled up," he said, loading 2 shells into the shotgun with a sharp click. We ran back through the storm to my house, Jebediah leading the way with his shotgun held ready. When we got to the front yard, we stopped, crouching behind a big oak tree near the edge of the porch. We peered around the tree, towards the porch. The porch light was still flickering, casting long, dancing shadows, and it was still there, that shape, that massive, hunched-over shape. But now it was moving away from the window, towards the edge of the porch, like it was about to leave. It was even bigger than it looked before. And now, in the flickering light, I could see more details. The skin wasn't just dark, it was textured, like it was covered in scales or plates or something, and the lumps and bumps on its body, they seemed to shift and move, like there was something alive under the skin. And then I saw its head. It turned its head slightly, just enough for the porch light to catch part of its face. And oh God, that face! It wasn't a face like any animal or any man. It was twisted, deformed. The eyes were huge and black, and they seemed to gleam in the dim light. And the mouth, it wasn't a mouth, not like we know mouths. It was just a jagged, gaping hole filled with rows and rows of teeth or spines. I couldn't tell, they were too sharp, too many, too wrong. It looked hungry. That's the feeling I got from looking at that face, hungry and ancient, like it had been hungry for centuries and nothing could ever satisfy it. Jebediah gasped beside me, and I knew he saw it too. He wasn't laughing anymore. His face was white as a sheet, his eyes wide with terror. The creature, it seemed to sense us then. It stopped moving, its head snapping around in our direction. Those black eyes, they seemed to fix right on us, even in the dark, and it started to growl, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated in my chest, a sound that made my teeth ache and my bowels clench. Then it moved, not towards us, not right away. It turned and it ran. It ran towards the woods at the edge of the yard, moving faster than anything that big should be able to move. It crashed through the bushes and trees, disappearing into the darkness of the forest in just seconds, leaving only the sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves behind. We stood there, frozen, staring at the woods where it had vanished. The rain was still coming down, the wind still screaming. But now there was another sound too, a ringing in my ears, the sound of my own heart pounding, so loud it drowned out everything else. "What? What in God's name was that?" Martha whispered, her voice shaking. Jebediah just stared, his shotgun still raised but trembling in his hands. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he lowered the shotgun slowly. I don't know, Homer," he said, his voice hoarse. I just don't know." We stayed under that oak tree for what felt like hours, just listening to the storm and trying to catch our breath. We were too scared to go back inside the house, too scared to move at all. We just huddled there, 3 people soaked to the bone, in the middle of the worst storm I'd ever seen, terrified of something we couldn't even name. After a while, when it seemed like the creature wasn't coming back, Jebediah finally said, "We gotta go inside, Homer. We can't stay out here all night." We crept back to the house, Jebediah and me in front, Martha behind, her hand clutching my shirt like a vice. We went back in through the back door, locking it tight behind us. We didn't turn on any lights, just stood in the dark living room, listening. The house was silent now, except for the storm outside. We could hear the wind and the rain, but there were no more shuffling sounds on the porch, no more growls, just silence, heavy, thick silence. Then we heard something else. It was faint at first, a scratching sound coming from inside the walls, like something was inside the house with us. My blood ran cold again. The scratching sound got louder, closer. It was coming from the living room wall, near the window where I'd first seen the creature. It was like it was trying to get in. Jebediah raised his shotgun again, pointing it at the wall. Martha screamed, grabbing onto me even tighter. I grabbed my rifle, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The scratching turned into pounding, hard, heavy thuds against the wall. The walls shook. The pictures rattled on the walls. It sounded like something huge was trying to smash its way into the house. "Shoot it, Jebediah," I yelled, my voice cracking. "Shoot it through the wall." Jebediah didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun and fired both barrels right into the wall. The blast was deafening in the small room. The house jumped. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling. The pounding stopped. Just stopped. There was silence again, except for the ringing in my ears and the pounding of my heart. We stood there, frozen, staring at the hole Jebediah had blown in the wall. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Just a hole in the wall. We waited and waited for what felt like another eternity. Finally, Jebediah lowered his shotgun again, slowly. He walked over to the hole in the wall, cautiously, and peered through it. Then he backed away, his face even whiter than before. He didn't say anything, just pointed. I went to the hole and looked through it. And what I saw in the darkness outside, it made my stomach churn. There was something out there, just beyond the wall in the shadows under the porch. I couldn't see it clearly, it was too dark, but I could sense it. I could feel its presence, heavy and malevolent, just waiting, watching, and then, in the faint, flickering porch light, I saw a glimpse of it, just a shape, a dark mass in the shadows. But this time it wasn't hunched over, it was taller, much taller, towering, and I saw eyes, 2 eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, staring right back at me through the hole in the wall, those black, hungry eyes. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired. I fired again and again, emptying the whole magazine into the darkness outside. Jebediah fired his shotgun again too, blasting another hole in the wall. The eyes, they blinked, just for a second. And then, they were gone, vanished. The shadows under the porch were empty. We stood there, panting, our guns still raised, staring at the darkness. Silence again, just the storm, and the ringing in my ears. We stayed up all night, huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep, too scared to even move. We kept the guns loaded, pointed at the windows, at the walls, at the darkness outside. We didn't see it again. We didn't hear it again, but we knew it was still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. When morning finally came, grey and wet and miserable, we went outside. We checked the porch, the yard, the woods. There was nothing. No tracks, no blood. Nothing to show that anything had been there at all, except for the holes in my wall and the terror in our hearts. We never told anyone what we saw that night. Who would believe us? A monster on Chapel Road. They'd think we were crazy or drunk or just imagining things. So we kept it to ourselves, just Jebediah, Martha and me. We knew what we'd seen, we knew what we'd faced, and we knew we'd never forget it. To this day, I can still see those eyes in my nightmares, those black, hungry eyes staring back at me from the dark. and I still hear that growl, that low, guttural rumble that chills me to the bone. I don't know what it was. I don't know where it came from, and I don't know if it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next storm. But I know one thing for sure. There are things in this world that we don't understand. Things that are not meant to be seen, things that can come out of the darkness on a stormy night and change your life forever. And Chapel Road. Chapel Road was never the same after that night. Never. Story 11. Okay, so this happened back in '65, Nashville, Tennessee. I still can't really talk about it without feeling a chill run down my spine. It's like some things you see, you just can't unsee, you know? And this was one of those things. Me and Terry Ring, we were driving back from, I think we were coming back from picking up some parts over in Franklin. Terry and me, we both worked down at the auto shop, Hudson's Garage. Yeah, Hudson's Garage, that was my dad's place. Anyway, it was getting late, real late. Past midnight for sure, the kind of late where the air gets cooler and everything just feels different. Quieter, you know? We were taking Brown's Mill Road because it's usually a pretty straight shot back to town from Franklin. Even if it's a bit out of the way, it was dark, pitch dark out there, country dark, where you can't see your hand in front of your face if you turn off the headlights. And Brown's Mill Road. Man, that road is surrounded by woods, thick woods, the kind that press in on you, especially at night. We were just cruising, not really talking much. Terry was fiddling with the radio, trying to find something decent, but all we were getting was static and some crackly preachers. I was just watching the road, thinking about getting home and finally getting some sleep. It had been a long day, greasy engines and busted knuckles. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something up ahead. Just a shape, you know, kind of in the road but off to the side a bit. At first I thought maybe it was a deer. Happens all the time out there. Deer jumping out in front of cars. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer. It was bigger, and the shape was all wrong. Kind of hunched over but tall. Real tall. I slowed the car down. Terry noticed too. He turned down the radio, and we both just kind of stared ahead. The headlights were just barely catching it in the distance, making it look all blurry and weird. It looked like something standing up, but bulky. Real bulky. "What the heck is that?" Terry asked, his voice low. I didn't know. I honestly had no clue. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't a person. It was too big, for one thing. And the way it moved, it was slow, almost like it was swaying a little. We got closer and I could make out more detail. It was covered in something dark, something thick. Looked like hair? Fur? I couldn't really tell in the low light, but it looked matted and tangled. And it was huge. Taller than a man, easily. Wider, too. Just this massive shape. "Pull up closer," Terry said, leaning forward in his seat. "Let's get a better look." I hesitated for a second. There was something about it. Something that felt wrong. Like we shouldn't be getting closer, but curiosity, you know. It gets the better of you. Plus, we were in a car. What was the worst that could happen? So I eased the car forward, slowly. We crept along the road, headlights now shining right at whatever it was. And that's when we really saw it. Man, I still see it when I close my eyes sometimes. It's burned into my brain like a brand. It was standing on the side of the road, right near the edge of the woods. And yeah, it was covered in hair, long, reddish-brown, matted hair, like a dog that had been rolling around in mud for a week. But this wasn't a dog. It was shaped like a man in a way. But all wrong. It was huge. I mean really, truly gigantic. I'd say at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. And it was thick. Not just tall, but solid. Like it weighed a ton. It was hunched over a bit, its shoulders broad and heavy. Then I saw its face. Oh God, its face. It didn't look human, not even close. It was simian, like a monkey, but distorted. Wrong. It had this flat, pushed-in nose, wide and almost snout-like. And its mouth was the worst part. It was wide, stretched across its face and filled with teeth. Not normal teeth either. These were long, yellowed and jutting out in every direction, like tusks almost, 3-inch teeth sticking out of its mouth. It looked like it could bite right through a tree trunk. It was just standing there, swaying slightly as we stared at it. It didn't seem to notice us at first, or maybe it did and just didn't care. Its eyes were, I don't know how to describe them. They were dark, and they seemed empty, like there was nothing behind them. No intelligence, no soul, just blankness, but also something else, something cold and hungry. The air suddenly felt thick, heavy, and it smelled awful, like wet dog mixed with something rotten, something decaying. It was a smell that made your stomach churn. We just sat there staring, frozen. Neither of us said anything. What could we say? Our brains were just trying to process what we were seeing and failing miserably. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, something from a nightmare, but standing right there in front of us, real as the car we were sitting in. Then it moved. Slowly, it lifted its head. Those dark, empty eyes seemed to fix on us, or maybe just on the car. I couldn't tell, but it started to turn its head towards us, and that smell got stronger, almost suffocating. Panic started to bubble up in my chest, real, gut-wrenching panic. This wasn't right. This was so wrong. "Terry," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Terry, we gotta go." Terry didn't say anything, but I saw his face in the dim light. He was pale, whiter than a ghost. His eyes were wide, fixed on the creature. He was just as scared as I was, maybe more. I put the car in drive, my hands shaking so bad I almost missed the gear. I didn't even think about turning around. I just knew we had to get away from that thing. I put my foot down on the gas. The tires spun for a second, kicking up gravel, and then we shot forward. We sped past the creature, going as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the road ahead, not daring to look back. But Terry did. "Holy!" he yelled. I slammed on the brakes, almost throwing us both through the windshield. "What? What is it?" I shouted, my heart pounding in my ears. Terry was pointing back, his hand shaking so much he could barely keep it still. It jumped the fence." I twisted around in my seat, my blood turning to ice. Back there, in the headlights, I saw it. The creature. It was right there at the side of the road next to a wooden fence that ran along the edge of the woods, and it was jumping. Not like a normal jump, not like anything I'd ever seen. It was effortless. It just pushed off the ground and launched itself over that fence. And the fence, man, that was a 5-foot fence. Easy. But it didn't even slow the thing down. It went right over it, like it was nothing, like it was jumping over a curb. And when it landed on the other side, the fence, it didn't just bend or creak. It shattered. I mean splintered, cracked, just ripped apart under its weight, like it was made of toothpicks. The sound of that fence breaking, it was like a gunshot in the quiet night. A loud, sharp crack that echoed in the air. And then silence, except for the sound of our own ragged breathing. We just stared at the spot where the fence had been, at the dark woods beyond, stared at nothing because the creature was gone, hidden in the trees. But we both knew it was there, somewhere in those woods, watching us, waiting. I don't know how long we sat there, frozen in terror. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Finally, Terry managed to croak out, "Drive, just drive, Roy, please." I didn't need to be told twice. I put the car back in drive and floored it. We sped down Browns Mill Road like demons were chasing us, and maybe they were, in a way. Maybe something was chasing us that night, something we didn't understand, something that was wrong. We didn't stop driving until we reached town, until we saw streetlights and houses and people. We pulled up to the first gas station we saw, our hands still shaking, our faces still white. We just sat there for a while in the car, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what we had just seen. Of course, it didn't make any sense. It couldn't have happened. Creatures like that, they don't exist. They're stories, myths. But we both saw it. We both smelled it. We both felt the fear of it. Finally, Terry said in a shaky voice, "We gotta tell someone. We gotta report this." Report it? To who? Who would believe us? We'd sound like a couple of crazy hillbillies, but Terry was insistent. "We gotta try," he said. "Someone needs to know." So we drove to the sheriff's office. It was late, but there was always a deputy on duty. We walked inside, still feeling shaky and unreal, and told the guy behind the desk what we had seen. Deputy something or other. Young guy, with a bored look on his face. He listened to our story, his eyebrows slowly creeping up his forehead as we talked. He didn't laugh, at least not to our faces, but you could see the doubt in his eyes. We described the creature as best we could. The hair, the size, the face, the teeth, the smell, the way it jumped the fence. We told him exactly where it was, on Brown's Mill Road, near the old Johnson farm. When we were done, the deputy just looked at us for a long moment, then sighed. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, boys. I'll go check it out." He clearly didn't believe us. He probably thought we'd been drinking or maybe just seeing things in the dark. But he was a deputy. He had to at least pretend to take us seriously. So he got in his car and drove off. We waited at the sheriff's office, pacing around, still jittery, still trying to wrap our minds around what had happened. We must have waited there for an hour, maybe longer. It felt like forever. Then the deputy came back. He walked in and he looked different. His face wasn't bored anymore. It was pale, almost as white as Terry's had been. His eyes were wide and, yeah, he was shaken. I could see it in his face, in the way he moved. He came straight over to us, and his voice was low, serious. You boys weren't kidding, were you?" We just shook our heads. What could we say? We knew we hadn't been kidding. We'd seen it. He swallowed hard, then said, "I just got back from Brown's Mill Road." He paused, then said, "And I ran into a couple, Doris Barrett and Terry Lester. They saw something too." He explained that he'd been driving back towards Murfreesboro, which is on the other side of Brown's Mill Road, when he saw another car pulled over to the side of the road. It was Doris and Terry. They were standing by their car, looking scared to death. They told him they'd seen something on Brown's Mill Road, something big, hairy, and monstrous. They described it almost exactly like we had. The size, the hair, the teeth, everything. The deputy said they were terrified, said it jumped out in front of their car, just like you said. He looked at us, his eyes still wide. And they said something about a fence, a broken fence. Terry and me just stared at him. We didn't say anything. What was there to say? The deputy went on. "I went to where you said it was, near the Johnson farm, and the fence is gone. Or it's broken, smashed to pieces, like something really big went through it." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what the hell you boys saw out there, and I don't know what Doris and Terry saw, but something happened out on Brown's Mill Road tonight. Something bad." That was it. That's all he said. He didn't know what it was. He couldn't explain it, and neither could we. We went home that night, still shaken to our core. We didn't sleep much. Every little noise, every shadow made us jump. We kept seeing that face in our minds, those empty eyes, those jutting teeth, that monstrous shape. The next day, word started to spread around town. People were talking, whispering, about something out on Brown's Mill Road, about a monster. Some folks laughed it off, said we were all crazy. Some people were scared, real scared. The sheriff sent out some deputies to patrol Brown's Mill Road for a few nights. They never found anything. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Just woods and empty road. Eventually, things quieted down. People forgot about it, or pretended to. They went back to their lives. But Terry and me, we didn't forget. We couldn't. We never drove down Browns Mill Road again. Not at night, anyway. We took the long way home, every time. And even during the day, even in broad daylight, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, in those woods, watching, waiting, and to this day, I still don't know what we saw that night. Was it real? Was it some kind of animal? Something else? I have no idea. All I know is it was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced in my life, and I hope to God I never see anything like it again, because some things are just not meant to be seen. Some doors are not meant to be opened, and some roads you should just never drive down, especially after dark. Browns Mill Road, that's one of them. Believe me, you don't want to see what's hiding out there. Story 12. Okay, so this is, well, it's something I've never really talked about outside of my family. Even then, it's kind of a whispered thing. I guess putting it down here anonymous might actually, I don't know, might do something. Might not. Don't really know what to expect. It was fall of '75, October, I think, getting close to Halloween. Tennessee, Giles County, farm country, my grandpa's place. I was maybe 10, 11, something like that. My folks sent me to spend a week with him during fall break from school. Grandpa was a quiet man, worked the land his whole life like his daddy before him and his daddy before him. Old family farm, not huge, just enough. Cows mostly, some chickens, a few pigs, and corn and hay fields. Simple life, peaceful usually. That week was different from the other times I visited. The air felt heavier, colder even for October. The leaves were turning, all those reds and oranges and browns, but they felt muted, like the colors were fading even as you looked at them. Days were getting shorter, fast. The evenings were long and dark, and quiet. Too quiet. Usually on the farm you hear stuff. Cows mooing, chickens clucking, wind in the trees, crickets at night. But that week it was like the sounds were swallowed up, like the quiet was eating everything else. Grandpa, he was acting a little off too, more quiet than usual, which was saying something. He'd get this look sometimes, staring out at the fields or into the woods, like he was listening for something you couldn't hear. He wasn't sleeping well, I could tell. I'd hear him up moving around in the night, even though he was usually an early riser. I asked him once if he was okay, and he just patted me on the head, didn't meet my eyes, and said, "Just getting old, boy. Bones creaking." But it didn't feel like just bones creaking. It felt tense. The barn was always my favorite place on the farm. Smelled like hay and dust and animals. A good smell. It was big and old. Wooden beams. Gaps in the walls where you could see sunlight streaming through during the day. Cats lived in the barn, always a few of them around, slinking between the hay bales or sleeping in the sunny spots. Cows were kept there at night or during bad weather. It was safe, always felt safe, until that night. It started like any other evening. Grandpa and I had supper, just simple food, stew or beans and cornbread, something like that. Afterwards, he always did his rounds, made sure the animals were fed, watered, barn doors were shut for the night, all that. He usually let me tag along. I liked helping out, even just carrying the lantern. Made me feel useful, I guess. That night, he seemed a bit hesitant to let me come. Said it was getting late, maybe I should just stay in the house. But I insisted. Didn't feel right staying inside when he was going out there. Looking back, I think he knew something was wrong, or at least he suspected it. We went out to the barn around dusk. Sun was mostly down, sky was that weird mix of purple and orange. Air was cold, real cold. Needed to see your breath kind of cold. We walked in silence. Just the crunch of our boots on the gravel path leading to the barn. The quiet was louder than ever. Even the crickets were silent. That was the first thing that really set off alarm bells in my head. No crickets. That's just not right in the country in October. We got to the barn door. It was a big sliding door, heavy wood. You had to really pull to get it open. Grandpa had the lantern in one hand and reached for the handle with the other. That's when we heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, not at first, more like a rustling, coming from inside the barn, like something big was moving around in the hay. But wrong. Heavy. Too heavy for a cat. And it wasn't the cows. They were always settled down by then. They were creatures of habit. Get fed, lie down, chew their cud, sleep. Grandpa froze. He stopped pulling on the barn door handle. The lantern light flickered, making shadows dance on the wooden walls of the barn. I could see his face in the lantern light, pale, paler than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were wide, staring at the barn door like he could see right through the wood. "Grandpa," I whispered. My voice sounded tiny in the heavy silence. He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, listening. The rustling sound came again, louder this time, and then a different sound, a thud. Heavy thud like something hitting the ground hard, followed by a short, sharp bellow. Not a cow bellow, wrong kind of bellow, higher pitched, scared. And then silence again. Heavy, swallowing silence. Grandpa finally moved. Slowly he reached out, grabbed the handle of the barn door and pulled. The door groaned as it slid open, just a crack at first, then wider and wider. The inside of the barn was pitch black. The lantern light only reached a few feet in, couldn't penetrate the darkness beyond. Smelled different in there too. Not just hay and dust. Something else, gamey, wild, and something metallic, like blood. Grandpa lifted the lantern higher, held it out in front of him. He took a step inside the barn. I stayed right behind him, scared to be alone, scared to go in. "Hello?" Grandpa called out, his voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "Anybody in here?" Of course nobody answered, just the silence and the darkness. We took another step inside. The lantern light cut a small circle into the blackness. Slowly, shapes started to emerge from the shadows. Hay bales stacked high against the walls, tractor parked in the corner, feeding troughs. And then, the cows. They were all standing in their stalls, huddled together at the far end of the barn. Normally they'd come over to the front of their stalls when we came in, looking for attention or maybe a treat, but they were pressed as far back as they could get, facing away from us, their backs to the entrance. Their breathing was heavy, ragged. I could see the whites of their eyes in the dim light. They were terrified. Something had spooked them bad. Grandpa moved forward, lantern held high. We walked slowly, deeper into the barn, past the cow stalls. The smell got stronger, that wild, metallic smell. And then I saw it. Lying on the dirt floor of the barn, near the back wall, was something. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. It was a dark, huddled shape, half hidden in the shadows. As we got closer, I realized it was a calf, one of the younger ones. Black and white Holstein, probably only a few months old. Lying on its side, legs twisted at odd angles. Grandpa moved closer, held the lantern over the calf. That's when I saw what had happened. It was mangled, terribly mangled. Its neck, it was broken, twisted all the way around, like someone had just wrung it like a towel. Its ribs were crushed, broken inwards like they'd been stomped on. And its stomach, ripped open, guts spilling out onto the dirt floor. Blood everywhere, dark, thick blood soaking into the ground. I gagged, tried to turn away, but I couldn't. Frozen in place, staring at the horrific sight. Never seen anything like it before. Never smelled anything like that smell, that sickening mix of blood and something else, something animalistic. Grandpa gasped. He stumbled back a step, knocking against me. I could feel him trembling. He whispered, voice choked with horror, "Jesus, Mary, Joseph." He lifted the lantern higher again, sweeping the beam around the back of the barn. That's when we saw it. In the far corner of the barn, behind the calf's body, crouched something huge, dark, shadowy. It was hunched over like it was eating. We couldn't see it clearly at first, just a massive dark shape in the darkness. Then it moved. Slowly, it raised its head and turned towards us. The lantern light caught it then just for a second, but it was enough to sear the image into my brain forever. It was tall, taller than a man, maybe 7, 8 feet tall, massive, bulky, covered in fur. Black fur, long and matted, hanging down in thick clumps. It was broad, shoulders like a bull, and its arms long, reaching down almost to the ground. Hands. I couldn't really see its hands, just dark shapes at the end of those long arms. But it was its head. It didn't have a neck. Or if it did, it was so thick and short you couldn't see it. Its head just sat right on top of its shoulders, low and heavy. And its face, or where its face should be, it was mostly hidden in shadow. But I saw eyes, 2 eyes, glowing in the darkness, red eyes, burning red, like coals in a fire, staring right at us, no expression in them, just hunger, and something else, something ancient, evil. It didn't make a sound, just stared, those red eyes fixed on us, and that smell coming off it in waves like rot and wild animal musk, and something sulphurous, like something burning deep down. Time stopped. Everything stopped. Just us, the monster, the dead calf, the terrified cows, the heavy silence, the burning red eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I was numb with fear, absolute paralyzing fear. Then Grandpa moved, without saying a word, without even taking his eyes off the creature. He reached out and grabbed my hand, pulled me back, and then he turned and ran. He ran. Old Grandpa, who never ran anywhere, he ran like hell, dragging me behind him, backwards towards the barn door. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. I just ran with him, blindly, stumbling over hay and muck, the lantern swinging wildly in his other hand, throwing crazy shadows all around us. We reached the barn door. Grandpa shoved me out, stumbling into the cold night air. He was right behind me. He slammed the barn door shut, the heavy wood thudding into place. He fumbled for the latch, his hands shaking so bad he could barely work it. Finally, he got it latched. Then he leaned against the door, panting, his chest heaving, his face white as a sheet. We stood there outside the barn door, in the pitch black, in the freezing cold, listening. Silence. Just the wind rustling in the trees now. Finally, like the world was starting to breathe again. No sounds from inside the barn. Nothing. We ran back to the house. Grandpa didn't say a word the whole way, just ran, pulling me along until we burst through the kitchen door, gasping for air, hearts pounding. He locked the door behind us, bolted it, checked the windows, locked them too. Then he went to the fireplace, grabbed the poker, held it like a weapon, stood there in the middle of the living room, staring at the front door, poker in hand, listening. I was trembling all over, shaking so bad my teeth were chattering. I couldn't stop seeing those red eyes, that massive dark shape, that horrible smell. The mangled calf. Grandpa finally spoke, his voice hoarse, barely audible. Don't tell your grandma about this. Don't tell nobody. Nobody'd believe us. We stayed up all night. Grandpa sat in his chair by the window, poker in hand, watching the barn. I curled up on the couch, too scared to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. Waiting for I don't know what, for it to come out of the barn, to come to the house. I just knew it was out there, something wrong, something evil. Morning finally came, slowly, gray and cold. Sun barely managed to break through the clouds. Grandpa looked like he hadn't slept a wink, eyes bloodshot, face drawn. He still hadn't said much. As soon as it was light enough, he went outside, slowly, cautiously, like he was afraid of what he might find. I followed him, stayed close behind. We went to the barn. He stopped a few feet from the door, just stood there looking at it. Then he took a deep breath, unlatched the door, and slid it open. Sunlight flooded into the barn, dust motes dancing in the beams of light, normal barn smells, hay, dust, animals. The cows were still huddled in the back, but they seemed a little calmer now, heads turned, watching us warily. The cats were out, slinking around, rubbing against the hay bales. Everything looked normal, except the calf, still lying there, mangled, bloody, exactly as we left it. No sign of it, the monster. It was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. We checked the barn, every corner, every stall, behind the hay bales, up in the loft. Nothing. No tracks in the dirt floor, no sign of anything out of the ordinary except the calf. And an overwhelming smell, still lingering in the air, faint but still there, that wild, metallic, sulphurous smell. The smell of that thing. Grandpa didn't call the sheriff, didn't call anyone. He just cleaned up the mess, buried the calf in the back field, hosed down the barn floor as best he could to get rid of the blood. He did it all in silence. That night we slept in the house, doors locked, windows bolted. But it was different now. The safety was gone. The peace was shattered. I kept listening for sounds, watching the shadows, wondering if it was still out there, watching us. I left a few days later, went back home. Didn't tell my folks anything about it, just said I had a good time at Grandpa's. But I was changed. Something inside me was different. I couldn't shake the image of those red eyes, the feeling of pure terror, the smell, the silence, the monstrous shape in the darkness. Grandpa never talked about it again. Not to me, not to anyone as far as I know. He just got quieter, even more withdrawn. He lived on the farm for a few more years. Then he passed away. The farm was sold off. New people live there now. Probably have no idea what happened there in that old barn that night in October of '75. Sometimes, late at night, when it's really quiet, I still think about it, wonder what it was, where it came from, where it went, if it's still out there, still in those woods, in those fields, in the darkness, watching, waiting. I don't know. I'll never forget it. Never. And sometimes, when I'm out in the dark, especially in the fall, in the country, I can still smell it. That faint, sulphurous, wild animal smell. And I can't help but wonder if it's watching me again. Story 13. It was April of '76. I remember it clear as day even now, like it was yesterday, messing with me all over again. We were living out in Lincoln County, Tennessee, real rural, you know. Middle of nowhere, feels more like it looking back. Our place was a small farmhouse, nothing fancy, just home. I had Gary then. He was 4, a little ball of sunshine even when things got tough, and Lord knows they did. Robert, my husband, he worked over at the mill, hard work, long hours, but he provided, always did. That night, it had been a normal evening. Dinner was done, dishes cleared. Gary, bless his heart, was restless, full of that kid energy you can't burn out no matter how hard you try. He was playing in the living room, making car noises and crashing his little toy trucks together. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, thinking about getting him ready for bed soon. Robert was out back, puttering around in the shed, probably fixing something or another. He always was, fixing things. The back door was open, screen door latched, letting in some of the evening air. It was getting cool as night settled, that crisp spring air. Gary, he was always drawn to the outdoors, even at that age. He was a curious little fella, always wanted to explore. He wandered over to the back door, looking out. "Mama, want to go outside?" he asked, his big blue eyes looking up at me. I sighed, but what could I do? It was still light out, just the edge of twilight starting to creep in, and he'd been cooped up all day. "All right, baby, just for a minute," I told him, opening the screen door for him. But stay right here by the porch, you hear? Don't go running off." He nodded, that serious little face of his, and stepped out onto the porch. I followed him, leaning against the doorframe, watching him play in the yard just a few feet away. He was picking up little rocks, lining them up on the porch steps. Just normal kid stuff. I was relaxed, felt the slight breeze on my face, the kind that smelled of damp earth and coming rain. It was peaceful, you know, that kind of country quiet that just settles your nerves. And then it happened. Everything changed just like that. It started with a sound, a scream, but not like any scream I ever heard before or since. It wasn't human. That's the first thing that hit me. It was high-pitched, piercing, but deep at the same time, like tearing metal and a wild animal cry mixed together. It ripped through the quiet like a knife, made the hair on my arm stand straight up. It came from just around the corner of the house, near the side yard that went out to the woods. Gary froze mid-rock placement, his little body going stiff. He looked at me, eyes wide with confusion, and something else, something like pure, unfiltered terror starting to bloom. I pushed myself off the doorframe, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "Gary, come here," I said, my voice shaky even to my own ears. I reached for him, but he just stood there, petrified, staring towards the corner of the house. That's when I saw it. It came into view slowly, like it was just unfolding itself from around the corner of the house. It was big, impossibly big, taller than anything I'd ever seen, except maybe a giant oak tree. But this was moving, alive. It was a creature, no other word for it, standing upright, like a man, but nothing human about it. It was covered in fur, thick, matted fur that looked almost black in the fading light, like it soaked up all the light around it. It was massive, towering over the corner of the house. I swear it must have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Just huge. I couldn't see its face clearly at first. It was kind of shadowed by the fur and the way it was angled, but I saw the eyes. Even in the twilight, they seemed to glow, a sickly yellow color, burning bright and fixed right on Gary. And that's when the real terror hit, like a physical blow, knocking the air out of my lungs. It started to move, slow at first, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. It raised an arm, and that's when I saw the hand, or what passed for a hand. Long, thick fingers ending in these claws, I guess you'd call them, dark and curved and sharp-looking. The whole arm was covered in the same matted fur. It was reaching out, reaching for Gary. It was moving towards him, slowly but getting closer, those grotesque fingers stretching out. Gary just stood there, frozen, staring up at this thing. He was like a rabbit caught in headlights, just completely paralyzed by fear. Everything inside me just snapped. Mama bear instinct, they call it. I don't know what else to call it. All the fear, all the shock, it just turned into this raw, primal protectiveness. I didn't think, I just reacted. I lunged forward, grabbing Gary, yanking him back towards me with all my strength. He stumbled, gasped, but I hauled him in, right up against my body, shielding him, putting myself between him and that creature. "Gary, run!" I screamed, my voice cracking, but loud enough to cut through the shock. "Run inside, now!" He finally snapped out of it then. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, but he ran towards the back door, thank God. I kept my eyes glued to the creature, not daring to look away. It had stopped moving when I grabbed Gary. It just stood there, that massive form looming over me, those yellow eyes burning into me. It didn't rush me, didn't roar, didn't even seem angry. It was just there, watching, like it was toying with us, or maybe just studying us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My legs were shaking. I felt cold sweat running down my back, even though the air wasn't cold anymore. The night was wrapping itself around everything. I could barely breathe, but I held Gary tight behind me, pushing him towards the door. "Robert!" I screamed, yelling for my husband, hoping he could hear me over the roaring in my ears and the pounding of my own heart. "Robert! Help! Get out here!" I yelled his name again, my voice hoarse, desperate. And then finally I heard him. Footsteps, heavy and fast, running from the shed towards the backyard. "Jenny? What in God's name?" Robert burst around the corner of the house, and he stopped dead, just like I had. He saw it then, the creature, still standing there, massive and menacing in the twilight. He just froze, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Yeah, I saw fear in Robert's eyes, and Robert wasn't a man who scared easily. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, just vanished. 1 second it was there, casting this monstrous shadow over us, and the next, nothing. Just empty space, the darkening yard, the quiet of the evening settling back in, but different, wrong. Like something had broken the peace and left a stain that wouldn't wash away. Robert stood there for a second, just staring at the empty space where it had been. Then he blinked like he was coming out of a trance. "Jenny? Gary? What was that?" His voice was low, strained, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just seen either. Gary was clinging to my leg, sobbing now, shaking like a leaf. I was shaking too, all over, my teeth chattering. I don't know, Robert." I managed to get out, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know what it was." Robert rushed to us then, pulling us both into his arms, holding us tight. He looked around the yard like he expected it to reappear any second. Did it hurt you, Gary?" He was checking us over, his hands trembling a little. "No," I said, still shaking. It reached for Gary, but I pulled him back. It didn't touch us. But it had touched us, in a way. It had touched our lives, our minds, our sense of safety, and I knew even then that things would never be the same. We went inside, Robert carrying Gary, me stumbling along behind them, still staring back at the yard, half expecting to see it standing there again, just watching. We got into the house, locked the back door, bolted it, even though I knew it wouldn't stop something like that if it really wanted to get in. We sat in the living room, just the three of us, huddled together. Gary was still crying. Robert was holding him, trying to soothe him, but he was just as shaken up as we were, I could tell. I just sat there, staring into space, replaying the image of that thing in my mind over and over again. That massive shape, those glowing yellow eyes, that hand reaching out. Robert finally spoke, after a long, heavy silence. Did you get a good look at it?" he asked, his voice still quiet. "Can you describe it?" I tried to put words to it, to make sense of what we'd seen, but it was like trying to describe a nightmare, something unreal and impossible that had somehow invaded reality. "It was big," I said, "really big, tall, covered in fur, dark fur, like an animal, but standing like a man. And the eyes, they were yellow, bright yellow, like cat eyes almost, but wrong, evil." Robert listened, his brow furrowed, his face pale. He didn't say I was crazy, he didn't laugh it off. He'd seen it too. He knew. We gotta do something," he said finally, standing up, pacing the living room. "We can't just ignore this. What if it comes back? What if it goes after someone else? The neighbors, kids?" He was right. We couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. But what could we do? Who would believe us? We'd sound like lunatics seeing monsters in the backyard. "I'm going to Fayetteville," Robert said, his voice firming up, getting that determined edge he always got when he made up his mind about something. "I'm going to tell people, warn them." I looked at him, fear and a strange kind of hope mixing in my chest. "You think they'll believe you?" I asked, doubt heavy in my voice. "Maybe not," he said, "but I have to try. At least put something in the paper, in the Elk Valley Times. A warning. Maybe someone else has seen something. Maybe someone else knows what it is." And that's what he did. He left Gary and me at the house, locked up tight, and drove into Fayetteville. He was gone for hours, seemed like forever, every creak of the house making me jump, every shadow outside the window looking like it might be it. He came back late, after midnight, his face tired and grim. He'd gone to the newspaper office, told them what we'd seen. They'd listened, he said, even if they looked at him like he was a bit touched in the head. They agreed to put a notice in the paper, a warning, like he asked. He'd also gone to see Houston Smith, our closest neighbor, lives about a mile down the road. And that's when things got even stranger. Houston didn't laugh. He didn't call Robert crazy. Houston said he'd seen it too, not just once. He said he'd been seeing it or something like it in the woods around his place for 3 years. 3 years. He'd been living with this, seeing this thing, and never told anyone. He'd seen it at night mostly, glimpses in the woods, shadows moving where they shouldn't. He'd heard noises, that same scream Robert and I had heard. He'd seen tracks, big tracks, not like any animal he knew. He'd just kept quiet, he said, scared people would think he was crazy, scared of what it was. Finding out Houston had seen it, it was almost as terrifying as seeing it ourselves. It meant we weren't crazy, it meant it was real, and it had been out there, lurking for years. Robert's warning went into the Elk Valley Times the next week. A small thing, buried in the back pages, a little notice about a possible unusual animal sighting, and a warning to residents to be careful at night. Most folks probably just chuckled and turned the page. But some folks remembered it. Some folks started talking. Whispers started going around, stories surfacing, people remembering strange sounds, unusual tracks, fleeting glimpses in the woods, things they'd dismissed or ignored at the time. And me? I haven't been the same since that night. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. That hulking shape, those burning yellow eyes. I can still hear that scream in my nightmares. We moved away from that place a few years later. Couldn't stay there anymore, not after that. Too many memories, too much fear. But even now, all these years later, whenever night starts to fall, I get that chill, that prickle on my skin, remembering that evening, that scream, that thing. And I still wonder sometimes what it was, what it wanted, and if it's still out there somewhere in the shadows. I don't have any answers, just the memory and the fear and the absolute certainty that what we saw that night was real, and it was terrifying. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and everyone else is asleep, I swear I can still hear it, just faintly, carried on the wind, that scream. And I know in my heart that whatever it was, it's still out there, watching, waiting, and we are never truly safe. Story 14. It's still hard to even talk about it, you know. Even now, months later, people are going to think I'm crazy. I know it. But something happened. Something real weird and real scary. And I don't know what to make of it. It's messed with me and my daughter Clara in a way I can't even explain. We live in Willow Creek. It's a small place, pretty quiet, mostly woods and farms around. Never been much to worry about besides the occasional deer in the garden or maybe a bear if you're hiking way out in the national forest, which we don't do much. I mean, Willow Creek is supposed to be safe, you know? That's why we moved here 10 years ago. Quiet and safe. Wrong on both counts now, I guess. It started last fall, maybe October, late October. Coming home from work one evening. I worked the late shift at the diner in town. It was dark, real dark. The kind of dark you only get out here away from the city lights. Just me and my old pickup on that stretch of road past Old Man Hemlock's place. He's long gone, just the overgrown fields and woods left. And then, just as my headlights hit it, I saw something at the side of the road. It was white, tall, really tall, and kind of shapeless. At first I thought maybe it was a deer, but deer aren't white, not around here, and it was too big. Way too big. This thing was standing upright, and it must have been at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was kind of hunched, but still massive, and the white, it wasn't clean white, it was like dirty white, like old snow that's been sitting around too long, covered in, I don't know, like matted fur or something. It was hard to make out details in the headlights. Everything was blurry, fast. My heart jumped into my throat. I slowed down instinctively, wanting to see what it was. but at the same time, every fiber in my body screamed at me to get away. Before I could really even think about stopping, it just moved. Not ran, not even walked really. More like it just flowed into the trees. 1 second it was there, that huge white shape, and the next, nothing. Just dark woods again. I kept driving, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dark, or maybe a big albino deer, even though I knew that was dumb. I tried to brush it off when I got home, didn't say anything to Clara, didn't want to worry her over nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That image, that pale shape in the darkness, it was stuck in my head. A few weeks went by, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, that it was stress or tiredness or whatever. Then it happened again. This time Clara was with me. We were coming back from town, stopped at the grocery store, and it was dark again, same time of night, pretty much the same stretch of road. And there it was again. This time it was closer, standing right at the edge of the road, almost under the flickering streetlight they put up by Miller's farm last year. It was clearer this time, but not clearer in a good way. It was still whitish, that same dirty, matted look, and it was definitely covered in fur, long, shaggy fur. Its body was weirdly shaped, kind of bulky and lopsided, not like a bear, not like anything I'd ever seen. It just looked wrong. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes, they were red, bright, glowing red, even in the weak streetlight, just 2 points of burning red staring right at us, staring right through us. That's what really got to me, that feeling of being looked at, really looked at, by something that wasn't human, wasn't animal, just something else. Clara saw it at the same time I did. I heard her gasp beside me, and I looked over, and her face was white, her eyes wide with pure terror. She didn't say anything, couldn't, I think. She was just frozen, staring. And I was too, for a second, just frozen, watching this thing. Then it made a noise, a low growl, but not like a dog, not like a bear, nothing natural. It was deep, guttural, like it was coming from deep inside the earth, a rumbling, vibrating sound that went right through your bones. It was evil sounding, I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the sound of pure malice. That snapped us out of it. I think both of us reacted at the same time. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The truck jumped forward, tires spitting gravel, and we were gone. We didn't say a word to each other until we were back in the driveway, parked in front of the house, engine still running. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring straight ahead. Finally, Clara whispered, "What was that, Mom? What was that?" Her voice was shaking. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to scare her more, but I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it. I took a deep breath and said, I don't know, honey, I don't know." And that was the truth. I honestly had no idea. I felt sick to my stomach, terrified and confused. We went inside, locked all the doors, checked the windows. We were jumpy all night. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window made us flinch. We slept with the lights on, which we hadn't done since Clara was little. After that night, things just got worse. The sightings didn't stop. They became more frequent. Not always when we were driving. Sometimes I'd just see something out of the corner of my eye when I was in the yard, a flash of white in the woods. Or I'd hear something at night, that low growling sound, carried on the wind. It always felt like it was close, too close. We started to avoid driving at night if we could. I asked for earlier shifts at the diner. Clara tried to get home from her friends' houses before dark. We were living our lives around this thing, this fear. It was always there, hanging over us. One night, it was winter now, January, cold, and there was snow on the ground. Clara was out later than usual. She'd gone to Sarah's house to study, and Sarah's mom was supposed to bring her home, but something happened. Sarah's car wouldn't start or something, so Clara ended up having to walk. It's not that far, maybe half a mile, but it was dark and cold and snowy. I was worried sick. I was waiting up for her, pacing the living room, looking out the window every few minutes. The snow was falling lightly. Everything outside was white and quiet and eerie. And then I saw her. Clara was walking up the driveway, head down, shoulders hunched against the cold. Relief washed over me, but then I saw it, standing by the edge of the woods, right at the back of our yard, where the trees come right up to the property line. It was white against the snow, but you could still see it, that bulky shape, that hulking figure. It was just standing there, watching Clara. I wanted to yell, to run out there, but I was frozen again, just watching, paralyzed by fear. Clara hadn't seen it yet. She was still walking towards the house, her back to the woods. And then it moved. It didn't rush at her, didn't run. It just stepped out of the trees, slowly, deliberately. It was closer now, much closer than I'd ever seen it. And the streetlight by the road caught it full on. I could see its face. I hadn't really seen its face before, not clearly, just glimpses in the dark, those red eyes. But now, in the snow-reflected light, I saw it. It was pinkish. Yeah, pink. Like raw meat or something skinned, not fur-covered like the rest of its body, but smooth, pink and raw-looking. And puffy, swollen. It was hard to describe, just wrong. Completely wrong. And the eyes were still red, but now I could see more around them. Deep black sockets, like holes in its face. And its nose, it was just slits, two vertical slits like nostrils, but elongated and distorted. And its mouth, I don't even know how to describe its mouth. It wasn't a normal mouth. It was like a gash, a tear in its face, stretching way too wide, with rows of small, sharp teeth, almost needle-like. It was open just a crack, but you could see them, see the inside of its mouth, and it was wet, glossy and wet. It turned its head, slowly, deliberately, like it knew I was watching. It turned its head and looked right at the house, right at me in the window. Those red eyes, they locked onto mine, and it was like it was looking into my soul, like it knew everything about me, everything I was afraid of, everything I cared about. And Clara saw it then. She'd almost reached the porch, and she must have sensed something because she turned around. She saw it standing there, that pink-faced thing in the snow, staring at her. She saw its face. She didn't scream. She just screamed internally, if that makes sense. She went completely silent, but her whole body went rigid. Her eyes went wide, wider than I'd ever seen them, fixed on the creature. She just stood there, frozen like a statue, staring at this monster. And then she ran. She turned and ran, not towards the house, but away from it, back down the driveway, back towards the road, away from the creature. I screamed then, finally screamed her name, screamed for her to come back. But she didn't hear me, didn't even seem to register my voice. She was just running, blindly running away from whatever she saw, whatever she felt. And the creature, it didn't move, it just stood there watching her go, standing in the snow with that pink raw face, those red eyes, just watching my daughter run away from our home. I don't know how long she ran. It felt like forever. I finally managed to break free from my own fear, to move, to run out of the house after her. I ran out into the snow, calling her name, my heart pounding in my chest, terrified of what I would find. I ran down the driveway, out to the road, and I saw her, just at the edge of the road, collapsed in the snow, not moving. I ran to her, knelt down beside her, shaking her, calling her name again. She was unconscious, just lying there in the snow, face pale, eyes closed. I scooped her up in my arms as best I could and carried her back to the house, my own legs shaking, my own breath coming in ragged gasps. I got her inside, laid her on the couch, called 911. The ambulance came, sirens wailing, lights flashing, shattering the quiet of the night. They took her to the hospital. They ran tests, did scans, everything. They couldn't find anything physically wrong with her. They said she'd just fainted, passed out from fear or cold or shock maybe. They kept her overnight for observation, but they released her the next day. Said she was fine, just needed rest. But she wasn't fine. She was different. Quiet, withdrawn, jumpy. She barely talked about it. She wouldn't even say the word it. Wouldn't talk about what she saw in the yard that night. She just went silent whenever I tried to bring it up. It was like a wall had come up between us. And I was a mess, too. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every shadow looked like that thing. Every noise sounded like its growl. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to do something. I started researching online, local legends, folklore, anything about strange creatures in this area. I found a website, a forum actually, about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I read stories from people who had seen things, experienced things they couldn't explain. And I started to think, maybe, just maybe, we weren't alone. I found mentions of things called cryptids in the forests around Washington state. Bigfoot, of course, everyone's heard of Bigfoot, but there were others, some weirder, some scarier. And then I found it, the Sasquatch. It's a local legend, mostly from Native American folklore, but some more recent sightings too. They call it the Sasquatch, or sometimes the white Bigfoot, or the pink-faced Bigfoot. Descriptions were vague, varied, but there were common threads. Tall, whitish, hairy, sometimes described as having a pinkish face, glowing red eyes. Aggressive, territorial. Said to be more dangerous than Bigfoot, more malevolent. Reading about it, it was like pieces clicking into place. The white fur, the size, the red eyes, the pink face. It fit. It fit the thing we'd seen. It was terrifying, but it made a kind of sense, in a twisted way. I found a contact on one of those online forums, someone who claimed to be an investigator of these kinds of things. Folklorist, he called himself. I was hesitant, embarrassed even, to reach out, but I was desperate. I wrote him an email, told him everything about the sightings, about Clara, about the fear, everything. He wrote back, surprisingly quickly. He said he was familiar with the Willow Creek area, said there had been other reports, scattered, mostly dismissed. He said he wanted to talk to me, in person if possible. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over, a few days later. He was older than I expected, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face, but serious eyes. He listened patiently while I told him the whole story again, from the first sighting to Clara fainting in the snow. He didn't interrupt, didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. He just listened. When I was done, he nodded slowly. Sasquatch, he said. It sounds like you encountered a Sasquatch. He told me more about them. He said they're reclusive, mostly avoid contact with humans, but sometimes they get territorial, or curious, or just angry. He said they are unpredictable, dangerous. He said I should be careful, protect myself, protect my daughter. He gave me some advice, mostly common sense stuff. Stay inside at night, make sure the doors are locked, get a dog maybe. But it was more than that. Just having someone believe me, someone who knew what these things were, it was a relief in a strange way. But it was also terrifying, because now I knew what we were dealing with. We weren't just seeing things, weren't just imagining it. It was real. The Sasquatch was real, and it was out there, watching us. We still live in Willow Creek. We haven't moved. We can't afford to right now. And part of me, maybe a stupid part, doesn't want to run. Doesn't want to let it chase us away from our home. But every day, every night, I look out into the woods and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting, getting closer. Clara is better, I guess. She's talking more, but she's still different, more quiet, more haunted. I see the fear in her eyes sometimes, especially when it gets dark. And I see it in the mirror too, in my own eyes. The fear. It's always there now, under the surface, a constant hum of dread. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if it's gone or if it's still around. I just know that something changed that fall. Something broke in our quiet little life in Willow Creek. And I don't know if we'll ever feel truly safe again. I just hope we never see that thing again. I hope it just goes away, leaves us alone. But something tells me, something deep down inside tells me it's not over, not by a long shot. And that's the scariest part of all. Story 15. Look, I'm not one for telling stories, especially not these stories. But I saw a post here the other day, and it kind of dug something up. Something I buried deep down for a long time. Figured maybe getting it out would be, I don't know, helpful. Maybe for me, maybe for someone else who's seen something they can't explain. It was back in 99. I was logging up near Timber Ridge. Name's Jack, by the way, but everyone around those parts just called me Saw Old back then. Guess it was the truck, a beat-up Ford F-350, but she got the job done. Anyway, end of a long day, sun had already dipped below the trees hours ago, and I was hauling a full load of timber down Black Bear Road. That road is a bitch, all twists and turns, especially at night. Radio was on, some country station trying to keep me awake. I was bone-tired, you know? The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones, makes your eyelids heavy even when you're fighting them. I was rounding this really tight curve, the kind where you got to practically crawl even in daylight. Headlights cut through the black, and for a second I thought I saw something in the road. My brain, all fuzzy from the day, first registered it as a deer maybe, but then as I got closer it was wrong, just wrong. I slammed on the brakes, truck groaning and skidding, logs shifting behind me. Engine stalled out, died right there in the middle of the curve. Silence hit me like a wall, just the hum in my ears and the creak of the cooling engine. And then I really saw it. It was standing in the middle of the road, blocking the whole damn thing. At first, all I could make out was this huge dark shape against the darker woods behind it. Then my eyes adjusted to the dim light spilling from my headlights, and Jesus! It wasn't a bear, wasn't a deer, wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or even heard tell of. It was standing upright like a person, but bigger, way bigger, taller than any man has a right to be, maybe 8-9 feet tall. Hard to judge in the dark, but it was massive, thick, muscles bulging even in the shadows, and the fur. It was covered in fur head to toe, not like bear fur, all shaggy and brown. This was different, thick, matted looking, and this weird grey-blue color, like smoke, if smoke could grow hair. It was hanging in heavy clumps, moving slightly even though there wasn't any wind. It just looked unnatural, like it absorbed the darkness instead of reflecting light. My heart started hammering against my ribs, felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. Cold sweat broke out all over me, even though the night was cold, crisp mountain air. My mouth went dry. I just stared, frozen in my seat, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. It stood there, just watching me. No sudden movements, no growls, no snorts like you'd expect from a bear or something wild. Just still. Except not quite still. It was swaying slightly like a tree in a gentle breeze, but there was no breeze. And its head, it was tilting slowly, side to side, like it was studying me, trying to figure me out. I could make out its face in the dim light. It was vaguely human, in a horrible, distorted way. Flat nose, pushed-in looking, and a heavy, sloping brow that hung over its eyes like a cliff. Its eyes were deep-set, lost in shadow, but I could see them reflecting the headlight beams, 2 pinpricks of light, dark and intense. And they were fixed on me, staring right through me, it felt like. I felt this wave of fear wash over me, colder than any ice water. Not just the jump scare kind of fear, but something deeper, something primal, like my body knew instinctively that I was looking at something ancient, something powerful, something that didn't belong in my world, something wrong. It didn't move. Neither did I. We just stayed like that, locked in this silent, terrifying standoff, headlights bathing it in a ghostly white glow, woods pressing in all around, dark and silent except for the buzzing in my ears and the frantic pounding of my heart. I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt locked up. Every muscle in my body was tense, coiled tight, ready to, run, fight against that? I knew deep down that running was pointless. If it wanted me, it would take me. I was trapped in this metal box and it was out there, free. And then its face changed. Just slightly, but enough for me to see it. The flat, heavy brow furrowed a little. Its lips, thick and dark, twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly. More like curiosity, or maybe contemplation. It was hard to read, but it felt intelligent, disturbingly so. For what felt like forever, but was probably only minutes, we just stared at each other. Me, trapped and terrified, and it, this thing, studying me with those deep, dark eyes. I could feel it looking at me, taking me in, piece by piece, like it was trying to understand what I was doing there in its woods. Then, slowly, deliberately, it tilted its head again. This time, not side to side, but down and to the side, like it was listening, or maybe smelling. I don't know. But it stayed like that for a moment, head cocked, eyes still fixed on me. And then it moved. Not towards me. Away. It took a step, a slow, shuffling step, and then another, away from the road, towards the dense woods that lined both sides. It didn't turn, didn't look away from me, just backed away, step by step, into the shadows. As it moved, I got a better look at its body. It was even more grotesque up close. The fur was thicker than I'd thought, almost like dreadlocks, hanging down its shoulders and back. Its arms were long, way too long, hanging almost to its knees. And its walk, it was awkward, a kind of lumbering gait, almost like it was injured or just not meant to walk upright all the time. It reached the edge of the woods, the line where the trees closed in, and paused there, just for a second, still facing me, still watching, and then in one fluid motion it turned and walked into the trees. It didn't crash through the undergrowth, didn't snap branches. It just melted into the darkness. 1 second it was there, this massive, terrifying figure, and the next, gone, vanished. Like a shadow disappearing in deeper shadow. Silence fell again, even heavier now that it was gone, just the crickets chirping way off in the distance, and my own ragged breathing. The headlights still shone into the empty road, illuminating nothing but asphalt and trees. But the air, it felt different, colder, heavy, like something had just left, leaving a void behind. I sat there, engine dead, legs like jelly, heart still hammering. For how long? I don't know. Minutes? Hours? Time just seemed to warp after that. I remember just sitting there, staring into the woods where it had disappeared, waiting for it to come back, waiting for something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to move. Hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the keys, I turned the ignition. Engine turned over, coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life. I slammed it into gear and just floored it. Tires spitting gravel, truck lurching forward. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, back on the highway, lights of town ahead. I didn't look back, didn't want to, didn't even breathe properly until I was pulling into my driveway, lights on in the house, dog barking his fool head off like nothing was wrong, like the world was still normal. I went inside, poured myself a stiff drink, whiskey straight from the bottle, and just sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination, anything but real. But it was real. I know it was. I felt it in my bones, smelled it, that musky, earthy smell it had, saw it, clear as day, even in the darkness. And I knew deep down that what I'd seen wasn't just some animal, it was something else, something ancient, something hidden. For weeks, I didn't tell anyone. Too scared they'd laugh, call me crazy. Timber Ridge is a small place, word gets around fast. Didn't want to be the crazy old lumberjack who saw monsters in the woods. But it ate at me, that silence. Kept replaying it in my head every night before I went to sleep, every time I drove down Black Bear Road again. Finally, I broke. Told Vance Orchard, the local reporter for the Timber Ridge Gazette. Vance, he's always looking for a story. I told him everything, swore him to secrecy about my name. He listened, didn't laugh, just scribbled in his notepad. The next week, there it was, in the Gazette. Local lumberjack's terrifying encounter on Black Bear Road. They called me Jack the Lumberjack, and him, well, the paper just called him the Creature. People around town, they talked. Some laughed, some shook their heads, some looked at me different. Like they knew I'd seen something, like maybe they'd seen things too, out in those woods. Things they didn't talk about. The story became a local legend, I guess. Jack the Lumberjack and the Bigfoot of Black Bear Road. Kids tell it around campfires. Tourists ask about it at the diner. Vance even wrote a follow-up a few years later about other sightings, other strange things happening out in the woods. Me? I try not to think about it. Try to bury it deep down again, but sometimes late at night, when I'm driving home from a job and the woods close in around me, dark and silent, I remember. I see those eyes, those pinpricks of light, staring at me from the darkness.